Hello everyone, I'm the storyteller, and today I'll take you on a spooky story. But don't worry, it will be a gentle and relaxing journey before you drift off to sleep. If you're looking for a tale that's just mysterious enough and gentle enough to relax to, then you've come to the right place. Now, find yourself a comfortable space, close your eyes, and let the story begin. Story 1. The paintings come to life. I'm not the type of person who believes in ghosts. Stories of walking dolls, shadows in corners, whispers in the middle of the night. I dismissed them as harmless gossip. But what happened in this house? I still couldn't find a reasonable explanation. I moved here 2 weeks ago. An old Victorian house, about 3 miles from the town center, located right on the edge of the woods. The rent was significantly cheaper than other areas, maybe because of its age or because of the strange stories the landlord had left out when I signed the contract. This house has a few unique features. You'll find it interesting. He smiled wryly, handed me the keys, and walked away quickly. At first, I didn't think much of it. I just needed a quiet space to work. A freelance writer, specializing in articles and horror novels. But then, I realized something was wrong from the first day. The paintings. In the living room, there was a large antique-style glass cabinet with intricate carvings along the wooden edges. Inside was a collection of old portraits, all in shiny black wooden frames with a protective layer of glass in front. No one knew who had owned them before, but they had been there for so long that dust had gathered at the corners of the frames. There were 8 paintings in all. Most of them were stern faces, men with thick mustaches, women in long dresses with high collars, deep black eyes. Some of the faces seemed faded, as if the colors had been eroded by time. But there was one thing that made my hair stand on end the first time I saw them. I had the feeling that they were staring at me. Their eyes were not the lifeless eyes of paintings, but rather thoughtful eyes, as if they had consciousness. That feeling followed me all day, no matter where I turned. I could still see them in my line of sight, silently observing. But the strangest thing happened on the first night, the change. I was sitting on the couch, laptop on my knees, trying to finish a piece of writing I had been working on. The pale yellow light cast shadows of pictures on the glass of the cabinet. I took a sip of coffee, sighing as the words on the screen no longer made sense. When I looked up at the glass cabinet, my heart sank. One picture had changed. The portrait in the left corner, previously a middle-aged man with a mustache, now had no mouth. His face was paler, his eyes slightly wider than before. I blinked. It must have been my imagination. But as I stood up and walked closer, cold sweat began to form on my forehead. His lips were gone. I stared at the picture, feeling my heart pounding against my chest. I tried to remember, to search my memory to see if I had seen it wrong before. But no, I was sure. I had seen it in full detail just a few hours ago. There was no way the painting could change. Paintings couldn't change on their own. I swallowed, stepped back, and tried to calm myself. It must have been an effect of the lighting, or I had seen it wrong. I quickly turned off the light, went to bed, and tried to forget about it. But sleep didn't come as easily as I thought. Knocking around midnight, I was awakened by a sound. Knock, knock, knock. Soft, steady, as if someone were tapping on glass. I froze, My heart was pounding in my chest. I turned around, looking toward the living room, where the streetlights were streaming through the windows in faint bands. No one was there. But the sound continued. I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and walked out into the living room. My feet were cold as they touched the wooden floor. Everything was quiet except for the tapping from inside the glass cabinet. My hand shook as I shone the flashlight in. Every picture had changed. Their faces were no longer intact. Some had no eyes. Some were missing half their faces. Some had only a distorted head with a wide-open mouth, black as a hole. But the most terrifying thing was, in the reflection of the glass, something stood behind me. I turned around, raised the flashlight. Nothing, just silence and the empty room. I felt my breath shorten, my hands cold. I didn't dare stand near the glass cabinet anymore. I rushed up to the bedroom, slammed the door, locked it, and huddled in the corner of the bed. Cold sweat ran down my spine. For the rest of the night, I didn't dare sleep. I just sat there, eyes wide open, listening to every little sound in the house. It was the first time, but not the last. The pictures, they kept changing. And I began to realize there was something in this house. Something that didn't belong to this world. Something that was still looking at me. I couldn't sleep after that night. Every time I closed my eyes, the reflection in the glass would come back to me. A vague figure standing right behind me, too close to be a hallucination, too real to be a trick of the light. I told myself it was just fatigue, that I had let my imagination run wild. But I knew I was lying to myself. The paintings had changed. I couldn't have imagined it. Strange traces. The next morning, I walked out into the living room, exhausted. The air in the house was heavier than usual. I stood in front of the glass cabinet, staring at the paintings. They were back to normal. They were all there. The stern faces, the classic faces of strangers, the empty eyes. No trace of the night's terrible changes. I felt a chill run down my spine. It couldn't be. I had seen them distorted, defaced. But now, they looked completely normal. I searched for any sign of abnormality. Dust still covered the glass, no fingerprints, no signs of moving or replacing them. But there was something else. At the foot of the glass cabinet. In the morning light, the wooden floor reflected a strange blur. I bent down and touched it. Cold, like water. There was no sign of a leak on the ceiling. No wet footprints in the living room. There was only a single damp spot right at the foot of the cabinet, as if something had been standing there for a long time last night. On closer inspection, I realized it wasn't water. When I touched it, the liquid was slightly thick, with a sticky feeling that clung to my fingertips. Something that didn't belong here. I stood up, pulled my hand back, my heart pounding in my chest. I had to get out of here. Warning. I drove straight to a coffee shop in town. I needed to get away from the house for at least a few hours. Everything was as normal as any other day. The locals were drinking coffee, chatting, laughing. No one knew that I had just had a terrible night. I took out my phone, hesitated for a moment, then looked up the landlord's number. After a few rings, he picked up. His voice was hoarse, as if he had just woken up. "Hello?" I said, trying to keep my composure. "I have a question. Those paintings in the glass case, do they have a history?" There was a long pause. "What's wrong with you?" he asked, his voice much lower than before. "Nothing big," I lied. They just seem a little strange to me. Who was their previous owner? A sigh came through the phone. You shouldn't touch them, he said slowly but firmly. Just leave them alone. His words gave me goosebumps. What do you mean? I asked. I don't know much. When I bought the house, they were there. The previous owner disappeared, and I don't want to know anymore. My throat was dry. Can you come check it out? I asked, my voice shaking. No. He answered more quickly than I expected. I advise you to leave. The call ended before I could say anything more. Night sounds. I returned home late in the afternoon. The sun had begun to set, bringing a light mist over the woods behind the house. Entering the living room, I felt that the house was too quiet. There were no birds singing outside, no rustling leaves. There was just a heavy silence, as if the air had been sucked out. I deliberately did not look at the glass cabinet. That night I locked my bedroom door and pulled the curtains shut. I left the light on, sat on the bed, and tried to concentrate on a book to distract myself. But around midnight, I heard it. The tapping on the glass. Knock, 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 slowly, patiently. This time, I did not move. I held my breath, my eyes wide open, staring at the bedroom door. The tapping continued. I felt a cold air rush into the room, even though all the windows were closed. Then another sound rang out, a small soft laugh right outside my door. It couldn't be. I clenched my fists, my whole body frozen. The laugh was not loud, not clear, just a faint sound, as if someone was deliberately trying to make me hear it. I could not bear it any longer. I reached for the baseball bat I kept under the bed, took a deep breath, and slowly approached the door. My hand shook as I reached for the knob. I opened the door, quickly, as if I hesitated, I would never have the courage to do it. No one was there. But the living room door was ajar, and from where I stood I could see the glass cabinet. One of the paintings had fallen out of its frame. It was on the floor, directly across from me. It was a portrait of a woman. Her face had been normal before, but now the eyes in the painting had been erased. Only 2 deep black holes remained. I took a step back, my heart pounding. I couldn't stay here anymore. I turned, grabbed my keys, and stormed out of the house, not daring to look back. The paintings hadn't just changed. They were watching me. I didn't go home that night. After I ran out the door, I drove aimlessly for an hour, my hands gripping the wheel, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't stay there. I couldn't sleep under a roof with changing paintings and whispering laughter just outside my door. I stopped at a gas station about 10 miles from town, went to the bathroom, splashed cold water on my face, tried to calm my panic. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw the painting with its empty eyes. It had changed. It had looked at me. I opened my phone, my hands shaking, and searched for the nearest hotel. I couldn't sleep in the car, and I couldn't go back to that house. The hotel I found was on the edge of town, about a 30-minute drive from my house. Small, quiet, not fancy, but enough to get me through for the night. When the front desk clerk asked why I was late, I just shook my head and handed over my credit card without saying another word. As I closed the door to my hotel room, I double-checked the latch. I turned on all the lights and turned on the TV to get some noise. But even so, I couldn't sleep. The new homeowner. The next morning, I decided I couldn't hide forever. I needed to find out what the hell was going on with that house. I drove back into town, not straight home, but stopped by the old downtown library. The town library wasn't big. but it had a pretty good local archive. I needed to know about the people who had lived at that house. Anything that might explain what was going on. A librarian, an older woman with silver hair, helped me look. When I mentioned the address, she paused for a moment. "You want to find out about that house?" Her voice dropped, her eyes wary. "Yes, I am the new tenant." She stared at me for a few seconds, then turned away, rummaging through the old documents on the shelf. Finally, she placed an old file in front of me. I flipped through the pages, trying to absorb every bit of information. The house had been built in 1896 by a wealthy family, the Whitmores. But what made me shiver were the next lines. The Whitmores never moved. They disappeared. In 1912, the entire family, Mr. and Miss Whitmore, their 2 children, and a maid, mysteriously disappeared. There was no sign of forced entry, no trace of murder or theft. The police turned the town upside down, scoured the woods near the house, but found nothing. The house had been abandoned for nearly 20 years before being sold to an unknown person in the 1930s. It had passed through several owners since then, but all had left shortly after moving in. An old newspaper article was tucked into the file, titled "The Mystery of House 14. Why does no one stay there for long?" I skimmed through the article. People who have lived in this house all have the same story. They feel they're being watched. Some claim to have heard whispers at night, seen shadows in mirrors, or noticed objects mysteriously shifting positions. A cold sweat ran down my spine. I was living in a house with that kind of history, and I knew for a fact I wasn't the only one inside. Return. I couldn't leave the house without taking my things. Despite my fear, I decided to go back, at least to pack up some things. The sun was high in the sky when I parked in front of the house. Nothing unusual. Everything was exactly as I'd left it. But as soon as I stepped inside, I sensed something different. The air was heavy, a musty smell permeating the air, as if the house had been empty for decades. I took a deep breath and slowly walked into the living room. The glass cabinets were still there. The paintings, they had changed again. This time all the faces were gone. No eyes, no noses, no mouths. Just a blur of grey, as if someone had deliberately wiped them clean. I stepped back, my heart pounding. Then I noticed something else that almost made me collapse. One of the frames was empty. It hadn't been dropped. It hadn't been moved. It was gone. The painting was gone. I turned around, trying to calm myself, and then I saw it. At the end of the hallway, leaning against the wall, just outside my bedroom door. The painting was gone. But it was no ordinary portrait anymore. It had a face. My face. My eyes were wide open in the painting. But instead of normal pupils, they were 2 deep, empty black holes. My mouth was gone too, just like the way the first portrait had changed. I felt my body stiffen, as if gravity was pulling me down. I couldn't stay here. I had to get out of here. I ran straight for the door, grabbed my keys, and jumped into my car, not daring to look back. But as I put the key in the ignition, a sound came from inside the house. The sound of shattering glass. I looked in the rearview mirror and saw the front door of my house slowly open. Someone was standing inside. A shadow. Tall, thin, face in shadow, but I knew it was watching me. I stepped on the gas, drove away, leaving the house behind. But I knew, no matter where I went, it would follow me. Story 2. Laughter of the Dead. I've never believed in ghosts, but that changed last summer when I took a job as a supervisor at an abandoned mansion on the Maine coast. My name is Ethan Carter, and I'm 35 years old and work as a real estate surveyor. My job consists of inspecting abandoned buildings, recording damage, and reporting back to investors. Blackwood Manor is one of the oldest structures I've ever seen. It sits on a cliff overlooking the roaring waves that crash against the shore. The 19th century Gothic mansion has soaring windows, a pointed roof, and intricate carvings that have faded over time. According to records, the mansion has been abandoned for nearly 40 years, since a tragic accident that no one dares to talk about. At first, I didn't notice anything unusual beyond the dilapidated appearance of the house. But as I stepped inside, I realized something was wrong. The air in the house smelled musty, but there was a strange scent mixed in. A faint scent of sea salt mixed with the scent of burnt wood. The wooden floorboards creaked under my footsteps, and the heavy, dusty curtains swayed slightly. Despite the lack of wind, I walked through the main hallway, where a huge chandelier hung overhead, rusted and covered in cobwebs. Every door I opened led me to a room that was empty, save for a few old pieces of furniture. All were covered in a thick layer of dust, like a curtain of time. But there was one strange thing. One of the armchairs in the living room looked like it had been sat on. The dust on the chair was shifted, as if someone had stood up before I entered. I tried to ignore the nagging feeling in my mind and continued my work. I opened an old map of the house to find my way down to the basement. I had planned to check the foundations to see if the mansion could be repaired. But as I put my hand on the basement doorknob, a sound echoed throughout the house. A soft, distant, but clear laugh. I froze. The laughter did not come from outside. It was not the sound of wind whistling through broken glass. It carried an eerie, almost mocking, yet melancholy quality. I spun around, but saw no one. There was only darkness stretching down the hallway. I took a deep breath and turned on my flashlight, shining it directly on the basement door. The thick wooden door seemed heavy, but when I turned the knob, it swung open with suspicious smoothness. A musty smell rose from the dark stairwell below. I shone the flashlight down, seeing old steps leading into a vast darkness. I hesitated, but then went down. The air in the basement was noticeably colder. The dampness had peeled off the plaster on the walls, revealing the rough bricks underneath. I swung my flashlight around the large room. A row of old wooden shelves leaned against the wall, some of them overturned, and items were scattered on the floor. But what caught my attention was a large mirror in the corner. The mirror was almost as tall as me, its wooden frame intricately carved with spiral patterns like ocean waves. The mirror was covered in a layer of dust, but I could still see my own reflection faintly. I stepped closer, raising my hand to brush the dust away. At that moment, a burst of giggles rang out right next to my ear. I jumped, turning around. My flashlight swept across the room, but no one was there. But in the mirror, I saw a small figure standing behind me. A child, short, with long black hair that hid his face. He didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there. I turned my head to look straight into the corner of the room. No one was there. But when I looked again at the mirror, the child was still there. I felt my breath quicken. I backed away, almost tripping over a wooden box on the floor. But as soon as I blinked, the image in the mirror disappeared. The laughter rang out again, this time echoing through the room, sounding like it was coming from every direction. I rushed up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind me. The laughter didn't stop. It echoed in my head even as I rushed outside, standing on the front porch and breathing in the cold night air. I looked back at the mansion, where the darkened windows were like empty eye sockets. The waves still roared below the cliffs, but I knew I had heard something, and I knew I wasn't the only one in the house. I don't remember how I drove back to the hotel. My mind was still reeling from what had just happened at Blackwood Manor. The image of the child in the mirror kept playing in my mind, along with the laughter echoing from an unknown place. It was late when I got back to the small hotel by the sea. The salty ocean breeze was still blowing, carrying a chill through the glass doors. I entered my room, locked the door carefully, and sank into the chair. My heart was still pounding, and a feeling of unease crept into every fiber of my being. I tried to make sense of it all. Maybe I was too tired. Maybe it was a trick of the light, or my imagination was playing tricks on me. But then, how could I explain the laughter? It wasn't just in my head, it was echoing off the old walls of the mansion. I pulled out my phone and looked at the map of Blackwood Manor that I had saved earlier. In the basement, next to the room with the mirror, there was another door leading to a small tunnel. According to the documents, this road used to lead to the coast, but was sealed after an accident. I have never heard anyone talk about that accident. The next morning, when the sun rose, everything seemed less scary. Pale rays of sunlight filtered through the hotel windows, shining on the deep blue sea. I drank a cup of strong black coffee and decided to return to the villa, this time during the day. Driving on the coastal road, I tried to calm myself. The light of day would help me see everything clearly. No more darkness, no more hallucinations. But as soon as I stepped onto the dirt road leading to Blackwood Manor, the creepy feeling returned. Dry tree branches stretched out like skinny hands, clinging to the grey sky. The sea still lapped against the cliffs, each wave like a mournful sigh. I pushed open the rusty iron gate and entered the yard. The villa felt like it was still waiting for me. Footprints in the sand. I decided to check the beach behind the villa before going inside. According to the map, that area used to be a secret passage. As I walked along the rocks, the sand here was wet and soft, as if someone had just walked across it. I bent down. There were footprints, small, clear, leading from the sea towards the house. The cold wind from the ocean blew past, making me shiver. The footprints looked like those of a child. But I was here first. I scanned my surroundings. There was no one. The sea was still the same. Desolate, not a soul in sight. I swallowed, then decided to go back into the villa. The chair rocked. I walked through the large door. Daylight filtered through the dusty windows, shining on the cracked floor. Entering the living room, I stopped immediately. The armchair I had seen yesterday was rocking slightly, as if someone had just stood up. I stood there, frozen. There was no wind, nothing to move it. At that moment, I noticed something on the floor, right next to the chair. Footprints, small wet footprints, imprinted on the old wooden floor. I had locked the door when I left last night. No one could have come in here. These footprints, where did they come from? A low laugh echoed from somewhere in the house. This time, it was closer, and not as cheerful as before. A shadow behind the curtain, I took a step back. The light from the window made the room less gloomy, but it did not dispel the creepy feeling that crept into every corner. I decided to go straight to the basement. The door was still locked as yesterday. I took a deep breath and opened it. The musty smell was still strong, but this time there was another scent in the air. The scent of salt water. I carefully made my way down the stairs, flashlight in hand. The walls were damp, cracks running along the dark corners. As I shone the light toward the end of the basement hallway, the old curtain covering the large mirror fluttered slightly. I froze. A small figure loomed behind the curtain. I couldn't see its face clearly, but I knew it was watching me. I tightened my grip on the flashlight, unsure whether to move forward or turn and run. The laughter rang out right next to my ear this time, cold, light, but it was no longer the laughter of a child. I stood rooted to the swaying curtain. My breath caught in my chest. The small figure behind the old cloth didn't move, but I knew it was looking at me. The air in the basement was compressed. The cold here wasn't like the cold of the weather, but carried a heaviness, as if something was waiting. I tightened my grip on the flashlight, took a step forward. The sound of wood under my feet echoed, lingering as if being sucked into the endless void. And then the curtain fell automatically. No one was there, but the mirror was still there, and for a moment, I saw something that made my whole body numb. A handprint was imprinted on the glass, small, wet, and fading with each passing second. I instinctively stepped back, my breath coming in short gasps. At this moment, a laugh rang out right behind me. Cold, creepy, and distorted like a sound twisted in space. I spun around, no one there. But at the far end of the basement, where my flashlight hadn't reached, the small door I'd seen on the map yesterday was open, revealing a dark passageway leading deeper, signs of the past. I wasn't sure how long I'd been standing there. The basement had suddenly become so quiet, I could hear my heart pounding in my ears. The low stone door in front of me was covered in green moss, and the edges showed signs of seawater erosion. A cold wind blew from inside, carrying the smell of salt, of moss, and something older, the rot of time. I shone my flashlight inside. The stone stairs led lower, disappearing into the darkness. No one had mentioned this in the report on Blackwood Manor. I shouldn't have gone down, but I did, underground. Every step I took made the gravel crunch under my feet, the sound echoing in the cramped space. The passage below was narrow and damp, with old stone walls covered in moss. Water dripped from somewhere above, forming small puddles on the ground. I tried to stay calm, though every step made me feel more and more that something was wrong. And then I saw it. At the end of the hallway was a small room. The ceiling was low, the walls were stone, and in the middle of the room was a rotten wooden table. On the table, there was an old doll. It was dirty, its hair was messy, its dark glass eyes stared at me. I stepped closer. The heaviness in my chest became more obvious. Under the doll, there was a piece of faded paper, the words scrawled as if drawn by a child's hand. No one can hear me. I'm still here. Play with me. I felt a chill run down my spine. The words danced on the old paper, as if they were still alive. And then the doll. It fell. Somehow, it fell off the table by itself. I stepped back, gripping the flashlight. At that moment, the laughter rang out again, not far away, But right in this room, the shadows, the flashlight in my hand, flickered as if it was about to go out. Panic rose in my chest. I turned, ready to run back up the stairs. But then I saw footprints. They appeared on the wet ground, small, wet ones, coming toward me. They hadn't been there before. I swallowed, shining the light on the wall. This time I saw it. A small figure standing in the corner of the room. It was short, thin, long hair falling over its face. My flashlight began to flicker. The shadow moved. It turned its head to look at me. I couldn't see its face, but I knew it was laughing. The laughter rang out, clearer than ever. It ran toward me. I screamed, turned, and ran up the stairs, cold sweat pouring down my back. I heard the footsteps behind me. One step at a time, closer, closer. I dashed up the last step, pushed open the basement door. The laughter was right behind me, so close I could feel its cold breath on the back of my neck. And then, everything was silent. I slammed the door shut, stepped back, my heart still pounding. The house was quiet again. But I knew, down there, in that forgotten passageway, it was still there, waiting. I left Blackwood Manor in a near panic. My head was spinning, my breathing heavy as if I had run for miles. Down in that basement, I saw it. The small figure, wet footprints, a distorted laugh that seemed to come from somewhere far away. But the scariest thing of all, it didn't want me to leave. During the drive back to the hotel, I kept glancing into the rearview mirror, as if someone was sitting in the back seat. The feeling didn't go away, even though I was miles away from the mansion. When I got back to the hotel, I slammed the door shut and turned on all the lights. But the light didn't make me feel any safer. I needed to find out. Forgotten clues. I sat down on my bed, opened my laptop, and searched for information about Blackwood Manor. The mansion wasn't just an abandoned house. It had a mysterious past. Old newspaper articles appeared. A death, a child, an unexplained accident. I opened a newspaper article from 1982 with a simple headline, Blackwood Manor Tragedy, Girl Missing in Stormy Night. I flipped through the old text. On the night of August 17th, 1982, 8-year-old Evelyn Blackwood mysteriously disappeared from her family's mansion during a storm. According to her mother, Evelyn's bedroom door was locked, but the next morning, the child was gone. The police searched for weeks but found no trace. Rumor had it that she had slipped and fallen off a cliff near the shore, but no one had found her body. Evelyn Blackwood, the name sent a chill down my spine. The child in the basement. Was that Evelyn? I flipped to another article, one published a few years later. The Blackwoods left the mansion permanently after a series of strange events. Mrs. Margaret Blackwood, the missing girl's mother, declared that she would never return to the house. There was something wrong there, she said. I could still hear Evelyn laughing, even though I knew it couldn't be real. A strange dream. I closed my laptop, trying to calm myself. Things were starting to make sense, but that didn't make me feel any better. I needed a break. But that night, I had a dream. I found myself standing in front of Blackwood Manor in the middle of a thunderous night. Waves crashed against the cliffs, wind whistled through broken windows. The basement door opened before me, slowly, as if someone was waiting. I stepped inside, unable to control my body. Inside the dark room, the large mirror appeared again, but this time, it didn't reflect me. It reflected a little girl. The girl was wearing a white dress, her long hair covering most of her face. But I could still see the smile, a cold smile. No joy, just emptiness. Then she opened her mouth. "Do you want to play?" I woke up, cold sweat running down my forehead. On my bedsheet, a small wet handprint. Back to the mansion. I couldn't leave. I needed to go back. It wasn't quite dawn yet when I drove to Blackwood Manor. The morning sea was grey. The waves were rougher than usual. I entered the mansion, this time without hesitation. I had to find out the truth. The basement door was still there, but this time it was open, as if someone was waiting for me. I took a deep breath and stepped down the hidden tomb. I followed the secret passage from before, going deeper. The air grew colder, and the smell of salt was stronger. At the end of the stone path, an old iron door lay, hidden in the darkness. I realized something. There was more than just a cellar under this mansion. It was a crypt. My hands trembled as I pushed the iron door open. Inside, the room was large, with mossy stone walls, and in the middle of the room, an old, forgotten cradle. I stepped closer, my heart pounding. Inside the cradle, there was a small skeleton, wrapped in a faded cloth. Evelyn had never left the mansion. She had never slipped and fallen off the cliff. She was buried here, the last laugh. I stood there, horror rising in my throat. I had found out the truth. And then I heard footsteps behind me. Softly, slowly. I didn't dare turn around. The laughter rang out again, right next to my ear. But this time, it didn't echo. It was really there. I closed my eyes. A cold breeze swept across my back. A small wet hand touched my arm. And then a voice whispered in my ear. "Thank you for finding me." Story 3. Castle of Ghosts. I used to think stories of haunted castles only existed in books and movies. But when I arrived at Ravenswood Castle, nestled in the Appalachian Mountains, I realized I was wrong. My name is Daniel Mercer, a paranormal researcher. It's not my job to hunt ghosts or search for sensational stories. I analyze paranormal phenomena using scientific methods. But this castle, it defies all logic I've ever known. I arrived at Ravenswood on a gloomy afternoon. A cold wind was creeping through the trees, carrying a musty, stale smell. The castle sat precariously on a hill, surrounded by dense, old-growth forest. From a distance, it looked like a forgotten ruin. But as I got closer, I realized it was strangely intact, as if time had never touched this place. I parked in front of the main entrance. The tall, vine-covered iron gates were half open, as if waiting for me. As I stepped out of the car, the crunch of gravel beneath my feet echoed through the empty space. Before I pushed open the gate, I felt a cold wind sweep by, carrying with it a strange sound, like a whisper somewhere in the woods. I stopped looking around. There was no one, just the gnarled trees, their branches rustling in the wind. I took a deep breath, reminding myself that it was just my imagination. I stepped inside. The inside of the castle was darker than I had expected. The main door opened onto a long hallway, the ceiling soaring with crystal chandeliers that had faded with age. Old portraits hung along the walls, the eyes of the people in them seeming to follow my every step. I turned on my flashlight, the light sweeping through the thick curtains, the furniture covered in thick layers of dust. I was not alone. The caretaker of the castle, Mr. Harris, had been hired by the current owner of the castle, a wealthy investor, to assist me in my investigation. "Mr. Mercer?" A deep voice called from the stairs. I turned, and the flashlight beam fell on a man standing on the third step. He was in his 60s, thin, with a haggard face and dark circles under his eyes, as if he had not slept for a long time. "I am Harris," he said, his voice hoarse. "I have been assigned to assist you during your stay here." I nodded. "Nice to meet you. May I look over the castle files?" Harris was silent for a moment, then nodded. "Follow me." We walked down a narrow hallway to the library. The room smelled of rotting paper, and the light from the windows was blocked by heavy black velvet curtains. Harris pulled a file from a shelf and placed it on the table. I flipped through old documents, photos of the castle through the ages, newspaper articles about unexplained disappearances. A note scrawled on the edge of a page caught my eye. "Strangers appear in the middle of the night. They never speak. They just stand there." I looked up at Harris. "Who are these strangers?" He was silent for a long moment, then said, "We shouldn't talk about them after dark." His answer sent shivers down my spine. That night, I prepared recording equipment and a heat-sensing camera to monitor the main hallway. I didn't believe in ghosts, but the reports of these strangers were strange enough that I couldn't ignore them. I set up the camera in the corner of the large living room where the reports of strangers often appeared. The lights in the castle were dim, only the light from the old fireplace occasionally flickering in the darkness. 11:45 p.m. I double-checked everything. Nothing unusual. 12:01 am. Everything was still quiet. 12:15 am. The first sound. It sounded like footsteps. Slow, dragging across the wooden floor. I looked toward the stairs. The darkness was deep. I turned on my handheld camera, shining a light into the hallway. 12:20 a.m. The front door shook slightly. I swallowed, stepping closer. 12:23 a.m. Cold air filled the room. The windows were still closed, no wind. I pointed the camera at the front door. My hands clenched as I saw footprints on the floor. Wet, dripping, as if someone had just walked in from the rain. But there was no rain outside. 12:30 a.m. A knock sounded on the door, 3 times, slowly, clearly. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my chest. Harris said nothing about this. No one said anything about knocking. I stood still, my hands shaking as I gripped the flashlight. 12:32 a.m. The knocking came again. But this time, it came from behind me. The knocking repeated, 3 times. Slowly, clearly, but this time, it came from behind me. My body froze. My hand tightened around the flashlight, the cold feeling seeping through the fabric of my shirt. I turned, the light shining into the dark hallway behind me. No one was there. I swallowed, taking slow steps forward. The knocking stopped, but the air around me was ominously heavy. I turned toward the main door where the wet footprints had been. They were gone. I bent down, touching the floor. The wooden floor was dry without any trace. I could have sworn I had seen them right in front of me, as clear as if someone had just walked in from a non-existent rain. The air was stifling. I stood up, hastily checking the camera. The screen still showed the empty hallway, but I felt something was wrong. I rewound the footage I had just captured. 12:30 a.m. nothing, 12:31 a.m. nothing, 12:32 a.m. The image jumped for a second. A figure flashed in front of the camera, I paused, rewinding the frame. It wasn't a shadow. It wasn't a camera glitch. It was a person. I stared at the screen. The figure was only there for a second, but I could make out the details of his face. A man, his skin as pale as wax, his eyes sunken. He was wearing a dark, old-fashioned suit, like something from the last century. What made me shiver was his lips. They were slightly open, as if he was saying something, but I couldn't hear any sound in the recording. I quickly rewinded the video again. 12:32 a.m. A figure flashed. But this time, I noticed something else. The camera angle clearly captured the main door. I knew I had seen it shake slightly, as if someone was knocking from outside. But in the recording, it was completely still. No one was knocking. I felt my heart pounding in my chest. My throat was dry, and each breath became more rapid. What the hell was going on here? I closed my laptop, took a deep breath. I needed to figure this out. I left the living room and walked into the hallway that led to the kitchen area. The kitchen was large, the furniture still intact, though covered in dust. I opened the refrigerator, which was empty except for a few long-expired bottles of water. I picked one up, feeling the cold glass in my hand. I was about to pop the cap when something stopped me. A vague feeling, like I wasn't alone. I slowly turned my head. At the end of the hallway, right at the doorway to the library, stood a figure. I couldn't see his face clearly. The library room was dark, only the dim light from the hallway shining in. But I knew for sure that someone was there. The person didn't move. I felt goosebumps rise along my arms. "Harris?" I said, but my voice was dry and weaker than I expected. There was no answer. I took a step back, my hand tightening on the water bottle as a defensive reflex. The figure remained still, not moving, not breathing, not blinking. I blinked once. The figure disappeared. I couldn't breathe for a few seconds. Every sense in my body was on edge. Every cell in my body screaming that I needed to leave immediately. But I forced myself to stay calm. I walked slowly to the library doorway, the flashlight beam shining deep inside. There was no one, but I knew I wasn't imagining this. I entered the library, my shoes creaking on the old wooden floor. The tall bookshelves were covered in dust, and a few books were scattered on the tables. I looked around, trying to find any trace of the man. A book lying face down on the table caught my eye. I picked it up. The title was faded with age, but the cover was 19th century. I turned a page, and immediately, an old piece of paper fell out. I picked it up, opened it, and read. The words were faint, written in a shaky handwriting. "They come every night. They don't speak. They just stand there." I felt a chill run down my spine. I quickly flipped through the pages, looking for more clues, but most of the pages were rotten, the words barely legible. I clenched the paper in my hand, trying to think. Something had happened here, and I was right where it was going. I went back to the living room, where my laptop and recording device was still on. I sat down, trying to collect my thoughts. Tonight, I had seen a strange man on the camera. I had heard a knock on the door behind me, though there was no sound in the video. I had seen a figure standing in the shadows, and when I blinked, he was gone. None of this could have been a coincidence. I checked my watch. 2:15 a.m. I decided to try something I wasn't sure I wanted to do. I opened the front door. It was cold outside, the wind blowing through my coat. I stepped outside, the flashlight illuminating the gravel path in front of the castle gates. I turned to look at the large wooden door behind me. Inside, a dim light was coming from the living room, and then I saw it. In the second-floor window, a face, white, staring down at me. I couldn't move. My heart stopped. Then, it smiled. I stood frozen in front of the castle door, my hand gripping the flashlight so tightly that my knuckles turned white. In the second-story window, behind the frosted glass, there was a face. It was pale, almost glowing in the dim moonlight. The eyes were hollow and empty. But the most terrifying thing was the mouth. It smiled. Not a friendly smile, not a harmless expression. It was a crooked smile, stretched so wide, it was unnaturally wide, as if someone had sewn it shut with a needle and thread. My whole body froze. My heart was pounding in my chest. My breathing was labored. I couldn't take my eyes off that face. It didn't move. It didn't blink. Just stood there, looking at me. I took a step back, and then it was gone. There was no movement, not a figure retreating into the darkness. It was simply not there anymore. I shivered, turning my head to look around. There was no one in the castle grounds. Only the wind blew through the trees, making indistinct whispers. What should I do now? Should I go to the second floor? Or should I run away now? But I already knew the answer. I couldn't leave without knowing what was going on. I turned back inside, slamming the door behind me. The heavy wooden door echoed in the vast space of the castle. I hurried to the stairs, each step echoing on the old wooden floor. The second floor was pitch black. I turned on my flashlight, the light sweeping across the paintings hanging along the corridor. The faces in the paintings seemed to be watching me, their dark eyes filled with mystery. I walked to the room with the window where I had seen that face. My hand trembled as I placed it on the doorknob. I turned it gently. The door opened immediately. Inside the room was a dusty space. A four-poster bed sat in the middle of the room, the curtains drawn, covered with an old white cloth. The window was ajar, but there was no sign of anyone standing there. I stepped closer, the flashlight beam gliding through every corner of the room. Then I saw it. A handprint was imprinted in the dust on the windowsill. It was no ordinary handprint. The fingers were longer than natural, the fingerprints faint, as if they did not belong to a human. My breath caught. I turned sharply, sweeping the flashlight around the room. There was no one, but there was a feeling that something here was still there. Suddenly I realized something. This castle was not just filled with strangers. It was filled with things that were not human. I left the room, back down the long hallway. The flashlight beam trembled in my hand. I had to find Harris. He seemed to know more than he let on. Downstairs, I found him standing in the living room, his back to me. "Harris," I called. He didn't respond. I quickened my pace. "Harris, I need to talk to you." He stood still. I touched his shoulder. And then I realized something horrifying. Harris was stiff, as if he had been standing there for a long time. When I touched him, he tilted his head to the side, but not in the normal way. His neck twisted at an unnatural angle. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. His eyes were empty, as if Harris wasn't there anymore. I recoiled, feeling like someone had just dumped a bucket of ice water on me. Harris's mouth began to move, but not in the normal way. It jerked, as if something was trying to control his body. What are you doing? I stammered. My legs wanted to run, but my body was frozen in place. Harris jerked suddenly, then straightened. He looked at me, but not with human eyes. I couldn't breathe. Harris spoke, but it wasn't his voice. It was a deep, distorted voice, echoing from deep in his chest. They're coming. I felt every cell in my body freeze. I stuttered. Who's coming? Harris didn't answer. The room fell into a deadly silence. Then I heard it. Footsteps, lots of footsteps. From the hallway, from upstairs, from all directions. I turned to look down the long hallway. The flashlight beam swept across, and I saw them. People in dark clothes, pale faces. They weren't walking normally. They were moving slowly, almost gliding along the ground. They weren't blinking. None of them made a sound, but they were getting closer. I backed away, touching the wall behind me. I had thought I would handle this scientifically. But now, all I knew was one thing. I had to run. Story 4. Whispers behind locked doors. I never thought I would be afraid of a door, but since moving into this house, that fear has haunted me every night. My name is David. I'm 37 years old, a freelance graphic designer. My job allows me to work from home, which I thought was a blessing. Until I realized I wasn't alone in this house. The house I rented was on the outskirts of a small town in Maine, USA. It was a quiet place, far from crowded residential areas, ideal for those who like privacy. I'm not superstitious, but I always had a bad feeling from the first day I moved in. The house was old but still quite solid. The dark wood interior and the small windows gave it a somewhat gloomy feel. But the thing that bothered me the most was the living room door. This door didn't lead outside, but into a small room, either an old storage room or a small, long abandoned bedroom. When I first got there, I tried to open it, but the doorknob was stiff, as if locked from the inside. I thought it was nothing strange. Maybe the landlord wanted to seal it. I didn't think much of it, but after the first night, things started to get strange. I remember that night very clearly. I was lying on the sofa, watching TV, trying to get used to the new rhythm of life. It was about 11 p.m. It was dark outside, except for the sound of the wind whistling through the bare trees in front of the house. I was about to turn off the TV and go to sleep when a small sound startled me. Click. I turned my head toward the sound. The living room door. It was open. I swear I had never touched it. I was sure it was still locked when I moved in. But now, it was open a few inches, leaving a dark gap as if it were an endless void. I swallowed, stood up, and walked closer. A chill ran down my spine as I touched the doorknob. It was cool, like metal left out in the dew all night. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open. There was nothing inside. Just a bare, dusty room. No furniture. Just a few stains on the walls and an old wooden floor that creaked as I entered. The room was much darker than the rest of the house, even though I had turned on all the lights. Something made me uncomfortable, like I had just entered a different space. A place I shouldn't have been. I quickly went out, slamming the door shut. I shook my head, telling myself it was probably just the wind or the old hinges were loose. Still, I put a chair in front of the door, just in case it opened again. But that night I realized I had made a mistake. Around 3 a.m., I woke up with a start from a sudden cold. I distinctly remembered turning off the heater before going to bed, but the temperature in the living room seemed to have dropped a few degrees. I shivered, pulling the covers up, but then I heard it. Clank. The creaking of wood echoed in the quiet night. I opened my eyes, my heart pounding. The chair I had placed in front of the door had been pushed away, and the door was open again, just like before. I jumped up, turned on the light, my heart almost jumping out of my chest. It couldn't be. I had blocked it. How could it be open? I stepped closer, this time more slowly, more cautiously. I reached out and pushed the door open again. It was still the same dark, empty room, but this time I had the feeling that something was standing in the shadows. I couldn't see anything, but I felt a presence. The air in the room seemed to thicken. A chill ran down my spine. I backed away, slamming the door shut, this time locking it with an old deadbolt I found in the landlord's toolbox. But I knew it couldn't stop there. The next morning, I called the landlord, asking about the door. He was silent for a moment, then said, "That door, it's best not to open it." My skin crawled. "What do you mean?" "Someone rented it before, but they left in the middle of the night without notice. Then I locked the door. No one ever came in again." "But it just opened." He was silent again, then sighed. "I think you should find somewhere else to live." I hung up. No answer, no explanation, just a haunting piece of advice. I stood there, staring at the door. It was still closed, but I couldn't forget the feeling when it opened in the night. There was something behind that door, and at once out, I started to feel that something was wrong with this house. After the call with the landlord, I couldn't concentrate on anything. Even though I had locked the door with a metal latch, I still felt like it could open at any moment. The air in the house became stuffy, heavy, as if there was an invisible being watching me. I didn't go into the living room for the rest of the day. I walked to the bedroom. The door closed, and I turned on music to try to dispel my anxiety. But even as I tried to ignore it, I could still feel that door. It was like a living entity, silently waiting for the right moment to make me panic again. At night, I decided not to sleep in the living room anymore. I spread the blankets and pillows on the bed, telling myself that it was just an old room with loose hinges. I was scaring myself, but then at 2:47 a.m., I woke up to a knock. It rang softly, very slowly. Knock, knock, knock. The knocking came from the living room door. I froze. It couldn't be. I'd locked it. I'd even barred it with a deadbolt. No one could open it from the inside. Knock, knock. I froze, trying to catch my breath. I listened. There were no footsteps, no sound of the window rattling in the wind, nothing but a soft, steady tapping. I reached for the phone on the nightstand, checking the time. 2:48 a.m. I hesitated for a few minutes, hoping the tapping would stop. But it didn't. Knock. Knock, knock. Not hard, not rushed. Just slow, patient taps, as if something inside wanted attention. I clenched the phone tightly, a chill spreading from my fingertips to my entire body. Finally, I forced myself to stand up. I stepped out into the hallway, walking slowly across the cold wooden floor. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. The living room was dark, save for a faint light from the street lamp filtering through the curtains. The room was eerily quiet. I stopped in front of the door. Knock. Knock. The knock was right in front of me. I took a deep breath, my hand shaking as I placed it on the latch. If I opened it, I could confirm that there was nothing inside, that I was just being haunted by my own imagination. But part of me screamed at me not to open it. I gripped the latch, pulling it. The door didn't swing open immediately, as if something was holding it back from the other side. My heart sank. I pushed harder. The door opened slowly. It was still empty inside. I stood still for a few seconds, my eyes straining into the darkness. The room was still as dark as ever. There was no sign of anyone ever standing here. No stains on the floor, no footprints, no trace of any living thing. But one thing had changed. Every time I opened this door before, the room had been silent. But this time, I heard a very small sound. A whisper. Not clear, not a complete sentence. Just a few broken, faint whispers coming from somewhere in the darkness. I froze. I turned around and slammed the door. This time, I not only locked it, but also pulled a heavy chair in front of it. I didn't care if anyone thought I was crazy. I wasn't going to let it open again. The next day, I decided to leave the house. I didn't want to be here at night anymore. I needed to get away from this place for at least a while to calm down. I packed my things, grabbed my suitcase, and left the house just as the sun was setting. I drove to a motel a few miles outside of town, booked a room, and told myself I wouldn't be back for at least a few days. But there was one thing that kept me from leaving without finding out. I needed to know what had happened to that house. I went online, looking for information about the house. There wasn't much data, just a few old real estate posts. I scrolled through dozens of articles until a name stopped me. A newspaper article from 15 years ago. Man mysteriously disappears from main house. Living room door opens after days of no one living there. I felt my blood stop. The living room door. I opened the article, eyes glued to the screen. William Carter, 42, disappeared without a trace from his own home. Relatives called the police when they couldn't reach him for several days. When the police arrived, they found the front door locked, with no signs of forced entry. But there was something strange. The living room door in the house was wide open, even though it had been locked. I felt choked as I continued reading. Investigators searched everywhere, but found no trace of Mr. Carter. They found only muddy footprints leading from the room to the living room, then disappearing right in front of the door. The footprints, that room. I quickly turned off the screen. My heart was pounding. Something had left the room last night. And now, I wasn't sure if it would come back. I sat silently in my rented room, my phone screen still lit with the old article about William Carter's disappearance. My hand shook as I scrolled down to reread the last line. Wet, muddy footprints led from the room to the living room, then disappeared just in front of the door. I swallowed, a heavy feeling pressing down on my chest. If the police had investigated the case and found nothing, then it meant they had never really understood what had happened inside that room. But I knew. I had heard the whispering. I had seen the door open, even though I had locked it. And most importantly, I knew I wasn't the only one who had experienced this. I wanted to leave town, leave that house behind. But at the same time, I knew that if I didn't find out, I would never sleep well again. I needed answers. I went back to the house. Even though it was dark, I couldn't stop myself from driving toward it. I couldn't let fear control me. If I wanted to find out what was going on, I had to face it. As I turned onto the deserted road, my headlights swept over the bare trees that stood silently like ghosts on the side of the road. The house appeared, dark and empty. I turned off the engine, sat in the car, and listened. There was no sound except the wind whistling softly through the eaves. I took a deep breath and opened the door. My footsteps echoed softly on the cobblestone path leading to the front door. I unlocked it, the door making a long, creaking sound as I pushed it open. It was dark inside. I fished in my pocket for my phone and turned on the flashlight. I stepped in, closing the door behind me. The atmosphere inside was different. Not only was it colder, but there was a heavy feeling in the house, as if I had entered a space that did not belong to this world. Everything was still in its place. The sofa, the coffee table, the TV. But I didn't have to look closely to know that the living room door had opened again. I felt a shiver run down my spine. I had locked it. I had used a deadbolt and a chair to block it. But now it was open a crack, the darkness inside as thick as an abyss. I stood still for a moment, my mind blank. I didn't want to open it again. Not this time. Thump. A small sound. Footsteps. I froze. The footsteps were coming from inside the room. It couldn't be. I couldn't mistake it. Something was moving inside. I took a step back, my heart pounding. I held the flashlight to the crack in the door. Light filtered into the darkness inside, but I couldn't see anything. Then suddenly, the door swung open. I stepped back reflexively, my heart stopping. No one was coming out of the darkness, but the room was now completely open, as if it was waiting for me to enter. I clenched my phone tightly in my hand, trying to stay calm. If I ran away now, I would never dare come back here again. I had to know what was going on. Taking a deep breath, I walked toward the door. The air inside was much colder than the rest of the house. The room was as empty as before, no furniture, no windows. But as I stepped inside, I realized something was terribly wrong. The floor was wet. I looked down. There were muddy footprints beneath my feet. The footprints were imprinted on the old wooden floor, stretching from the middle of the room to just before the door. I bent down and touched one of the prints. It was cold and damp. Someone, or something, had been here before I arrived. My throat felt dry. I swung the flashlight around the room, looking for anything out of the ordinary. There was nothing. There was no place to hide, no window where someone could have escaped. But when I turned to look down at the footprints, I realized something that made me want to scream. The footprints didn't lead into the room. They only went one way, out of the room. I didn't see any footprints leading in, which meant that thing had never been in here. It had always been in here. My whole body went numb. A cold chill ran up my neck, as if someone had been standing right behind me. I spun around. No one was there. But I could feel it. There was something there. It was watching me. I backed out into the living room, my eyes still glued to the darkness of the room. I grabbed the door and slammed it shut, my hands shaking as I pulled the latch. Click. I gasped, my heart still pounding. I backed away waiting. Silence. No more footsteps, no more sounds. But I wasn't fooled. I knew it was there. I grabbed my car keys from my pocket and headed for the front door. I didn't care if I had to turn off the lights or lock the door. I just wanted to get out of here. I got in, slammed the door, stuck the key in the ignition, and turned it hard. The car wouldn't start. I panicked and turned the key again. The car still wouldn't start. I gasped, my heart pounding. I looked up at the rearview mirror, and in that moment, I saw a figure standing in front of the house. It had no face, just a black shadow, standing still, motionless. I couldn't scream. I couldn't move. The black shadow was still looking at me. And then it started walking toward me. My hands gripped the steering wheel. My whole body froze. My heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my chest. It started to move. Slowly, no sound, no footsteps, but it was coming toward me. I frantically turned the key again. The car still wouldn't start. At this point, I felt like I was going crazy. I pressed down on the gas pedal, turning the key until my knuckles turned white. The car was still silent. I glanced up at the rearview mirror. The shadow had gotten closer. It was only about 5 meters away from my car. My whole body was cold, my breathing heavy. I could see it moving. Unnatural movements, as if it wasn't really walking but just drifting toward me. I slammed my hand on the steering wheel. Start it. And then, the car started. Without thinking, I stepped on the gas pedal. The wheels spun, screeching on the gravel. The car jerked forward. I glanced in the rearview mirror again. The shadow stood right behind the car. It didn't chase, nor did it disappear. It just stood there, in the darkness, watching me. I didn't dare look any further. I drove like a madman, rushing out of the small driveway. The wheels screeched, my heart still pounding, sweat soaking my back. As I turned onto the main road, I glanced quickly in the rearview mirror one last time. The house was in darkness. The shadow was gone, but I could feel it. It was still there, and it knew I would come back. I wasn't the only one. I drove all night, not knowing where to go. I didn't dare go back to the motel because I didn't want to be alone. Instead, I drove to a 24/7 diner near town, parked in the lot, and sat panting in the cab. I felt like I was waking up from a nightmare, but I knew it wasn't a dream. The open door, muddy footprints, knocking, shadows. It was all real. I went in, ordered a cup of coffee, but didn't drink it. I didn't want to sleep. I just wanted to find out the truth. I opened my phone, scrolling through the article about William Carter's disappearance. But this time, I didn't stop at the old article. I kept searching, and then I saw it. An old post on Reddit from 7 years ago. I lived in a house in Maine, and I ran away in the middle of the night. My hand tightened on the phone as I read each line. I rented the house in 2016. At first, everything was fine. But after about a week, I started noticing that the living room door was always open every morning, even though I had locked it the night before. I shuddered. I thought I had just forgotten to lock it, but then I started hearing knocking at night. Soft, like someone inside the room was trying to get my attention. My heart pounded as I scrolled down. I've seen the shadow too. I paused. I took a deep breath before continuing reading. It had no face. It had no clear shape. But it stood there, every night, right in front of the door. And I felt it wanted something. Oh my God. I scrolled down to the comments section. The post had hundreds of replies, but I was only interested in one comment from the author himself. I don't know what happened to the previous owner, but I do know one thing. If the door is open, it's too late. A chill ran down my spine. I quickly searched for the poster's name, but their account had been deleted. It's still following me. I sat in the diner, my mind blank. If what the person said was true, then I had triggered something by opening the door. I remembered the muddy footprints that went only one way. I remembered the feeling of being followed in the dark room, and I remembered the shadow in the rearview mirror. I felt like something was squeezing my chest. I had to go back, not to stay, not to fight, but to end this. I drove back to the house as it was almost dawn. When I got there, I found the door still closed. There was no sign of anyone else, no shadow. There were no footprints. But I knew it was there. I stepped in, feeling the coldness wash over me immediately. The living room was the same. Everything was normal, except for the living room door. It opened again. I felt my blood freeze. But this time, I didn't step in. I didn't need to look. I understood. It wants me to come back. But I won't make that mistake again. I quickly walk out, lock the front door. I take out the keys, climb into the car, and step on the gas. The house slowly disappears in the rearview mirror. But I don't dare look at it anymore. I don't want to know if the shadow is still there. And I will never come back. Story 5. Nightmare from the Old Roof. I never thought I would live in a house like this. It was old, spacious, and nestled in the quiet Pennsylvania countryside. During the day, it was nothing to be afraid of. Just an old wooden house with a faded tile roof and rotted boards on the front porch. But as night fell, when the only sound left was the chirping of insects in the large field behind the house, I began to feel that something was wrong. I moved here about a month ago, after taking a new job in a small town nearby. The previous owners were an elderly couple who passed away a few years ago, and no one had lived here long since. The real estate agent said there had been a few tenants before me, but none had stayed more than 3 months. I didn't care. I just assumed they left for work or personal reasons. But now, after sleepless nights, I began to understand why. The first time I heard the noise on the roof was around 1 a.m. It wasn't like the wind whistling through cracks or the branches tapping against the windows. No, it was like footsteps, soft but distinct, as if someone were walking right above my bedroom. I turned on the nightlight, listening in silence. After a few seconds, the noise stopped. I tried to convince myself that it was just squirrels or night birds, but there was something that kept me from convincing myself that everything was okay. The footsteps didn't have the randomness of wild animals moving. There was a rhythm, step by step, like someone was moving slowly, deliberately. I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and got out of bed. The darkness in the house seemed thicker than usual, enveloping me in a way that made me shiver. I went down to the kitchen, grabbed a larger flashlight from the cupboard, and stepped out onto the back porch. I looked up at the roof in the dim light of the distant streetlights. There was nothing but old tiles stacked on top of each other, some of them looking a little worn from age, but the unsettling feeling was still there. I decided to go back to sleep, but this time I left the light on and tried to force myself not to think too much. The second night, the footsteps returned, this time clearer. I woke up with a start, my heart pounding. It sounded like someone was moving across the old tiles, making them creak under their weight. I sat up listening. The footsteps moved slowly from the left side of the roof to the right, stopping just above my room. I held my breath. Then I heard a light scratching sound. as if something was dragging its claws across the surface of the tiles. This time I couldn't ignore it. I jumped up, grabbed my flashlight, and headed out into the backyard. It was so quiet I could hear my heartbeat. The wind blew gently across the fields in the distance, carrying with it the chill of the night. I shined my light on the roof. Nothing, but I swear, just a second ago, I heard that sound right above my head. I stood there for nearly 10 minutes, but nothing more happened. Finally, I went back inside, locked the door, and decided to take a closer look at the roof tomorrow morning. The first morning on the roof, I borrowed a ladder from my neighbor, Jared, a nice middle-aged man who lived a few hundred yards away. Ever since Mr. Parker sold that house, everyone has been leaving early, he said, as he helped me set up the ladder. There's something strange about it. I laughed, trying to sound casual. What kind of strange? Jared shrugged. I don't know. But if you hear anything on the roof, be careful. Lots of people have heard it. His words sent shivers down my spine. I climbed up, carefully examining each tile. A few were cracked, but there were no signs of animal nests. I crept up to the top of the roof to get a closer look, and that's when I saw it. The mark. Something had scratched the dust and moss off the tiles, leaving long, almost parallel grooves, as if someone or something with claws had crawled over there. I touched the scratches. They weren't too deep, but something was wrong. A cold wind blew, making me feel as if someone was watching me from somewhere in the distance. I quickly climbed down, feeling uneasy. The thing wasn't stopped that night. I closed the windows and pulled the curtains. I tried to convince myself that it was probably just a stray cat or something, but I couldn't ignore one important detail. The tracks on the roof. They were unlike any animal tracks I had ever seen. And that night, when the footsteps on the roof sounded again, I knew I was not the only one living in this house. There was something else up there, right above me. I couldn't sleep. Not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't dare. I lay in bed, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. Every little sound startled me. The wind blowing through the trees outside, the chirping of insects, even the ticking of a clock. But I was waiting for something else. Footsteps on the roof. It was around 2 a.m. They came, slowly, carefully. Each step echoing down from the roof above my bedroom. I held my breath, listening. The air in the room felt thick, as if compressed by the presence of something invisible. A chill ran down my spine as I realized the footsteps were stopping right above me. I couldn't take it anymore. I jumped up, grabbed the flashlight on the bedside table, and left the room. I didn't turn on the light. I didn't want the thing to know I was watching it. I walked quietly downstairs, where the door led to the backyard. It was dark outside, save for a dim street light a few dozen meters away. I lifted my head and shined my flashlight on the roof. Nothing, but I knew it was there. A cold wind blew, shaking the planks on the porch. I felt like an invisible pair of eyes were watching me from above. Unable to bear it any longer, I ran out into the yard, holding my flashlight and scanning the roof. I searched for anything that could explain the sounds, and then I saw it. Just above the edge of the roof, a small black shadow flashed by. I couldn't see what it was. Just a shadow moving so fast, it was almost impossible. But I was sure there was something up there. I backed away, my heart pounding. The flashlight in my hand shook with my breathing. But when I swept the flashlight again, there was nothing. The roof was empty. I couldn't figure out what was going on. I stood there for a few minutes, staring at the roof, but nothing more happened. Finally, I went back inside and locked the door behind me. I didn't sleep that night. Help from a stranger. The next morning, I went to find Jared, the kind neighbor who had lent me his ladder the day before. "I think there's something on my roof," I said, my voice hoarse from lack of sleep. Jared stared at me, his eyes narrowing as if I'd said something he didn't want to hear. "You heard it too?" he asked, his voice low. I paused. "What do you mean?" He took a deep breath and stepped out onto the porch, looking up at my roof from a distance. "They say something lives up there," he said softly. "But no one really sees it. They just hear footsteps at night." I felt my heart pounding harder. "Have you ever seen anything?" Mr. Jared shook his head. "Not seen, but felt it." His words gave me goosebumps. "Do you know what happened to the people who lived here before me?" He was silent for a long moment. "The old couple who lived here before? They left within 3 months. There was a family before that, but they didn't stay long. No one wants to talk about it much." I looked up at the roof again. The old tiles lay still in the sunlight during the day, looking harmless, but I knew that at night things were very different. "I'll have to check that place," I muttered. Mr. Jared looked at me for a moment, then nodded. "Be careful, kid." On the roof, that afternoon, I borrowed a ladder and climbed up to the roof again. But this time, I brought my phone with me to film everything. I climbed to the edge of the roof, careful not to step on anything that might collapse. The air was different up here than when I was on the ground. The wind was stronger, and I felt something strange about the space. I crawled closer to the top of the roof, where I had seen the shadow the night before. And then I saw new marks, scratches. They were longer, more pronounced than the scratches I had seen before. Not only that, there were small dents in the tiles, as if someone had been standing there, using a lot of force to cling to the roof. I shined the flashlight on the scratches, zooming in with my phone to get a closer look. But then, there was a noise behind me. Clang. The sound of wood creaking, like someone or something was climbing onto the roof from the other side. I spun around, my heart racing. There was no one there, but I heard breathing, a small faint sound, very close. I backed away slowly, my eyes scanning the roof. It felt like I wasn't alone. Then, from the dark corner of the roof, where the shade was, I saw something crawling out. It had claws. It wasn't human. I screamed, rolled toward the edge of the roof, and slid down the ladder in an instant. I almost fell to the ground, my knees hitting the tiles so hard that I hurt. I looked up, gasping. There was nothing on the roof, but I knew it was still there. And tonight, it would come back. I don't know how I fell off the ladder. I don't know what crawled out of the darkness on the roof. I only know that I saw it, and it saw me. My knees were burning from hitting the ground. My ankles were numb from the unsteady landing. But I didn't dare stop to check the wound. I looked up at the roof again. Nothing, no sound, no movement. Just the old tiles lying still under the sunset sky. But I knew it was there. A neighbor's worry, After leaving the roof, I didn't go back to the house right away. I walked into Jared's yard and knocked so hard that my fingers started to go numb. The door opened. He looked at me, his eyes worried. "What did you see up there?" My throat was dry. I didn't know how to describe it, but the answer was written all over my face. I was terrified. I don't know, I stammered. But it wasn't a squirrel or a bird, I'm sure of it. Jared didn't look surprised. Instead, he let out a small sigh, as if he already knew the answer. "You need to leave that house," he said, his voice low. I frowned. "Why?" He looked around, as if afraid someone might hear. "Because no one has been there for long, and because everyone hears the same noises you do." A chill ran down my spine. "Do you know what happened to the people before you?" Jared shook his head. "No one ever told. They just left." It was like they knew there was something on the roof, but no one had the courage to actually look at it. I had seen it, and that was why I couldn't leave. A sleepless night. That night, I decided to stay in the house. I couldn't leave things like this. I needed to know what was living on my roof. I had everything ready. A kitchen knife right next to the bed. A flashlight in my hand. A phone with the recording app open. All the windows were locked. I sat in the living room. All the lights in the house were on. The clock read 11 p.m. I waited. 1 a.m. Nothing. 2 a.m. Everything was still quiet. I started to tell myself that maybe I was imagining things. Maybe what I saw was just a hallucination in the dark. Maybe cracked footsteps right above me. This time, it wasn't as gentle. It moved with a heavy rhythm, as if someone were walking on all fours, no longer cautious. I clutched the flashlight, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew I had to do something. I couldn't sit still. I dashed out the back door, the flashlight shaking in my hand. I looked up at the roof. Something was standing there. It wasn't human. It wasn't an animal. It was something in between. The shadow was tall and lanky, its legs unnaturally long, its spine crooked as if it had more joints than it should have. Its head was bent, looking straight at me from above. I couldn't see its face clearly, but I saw its eyes reflecting the light from the flashlight, 2 white dots flickering like a cat's. It was watching me. It didn't run. It didn't move. It just looked. I couldn't move. I wanted to scream, to turn and run, to do anything to escape that gaze. But my body was frozen. All I could do was stand there, eyes wide, heart pounding so hard it felt like it was going to burst. Then it retreated into the darkness of the roof slowly, as if it knew I couldn't do anything. And then it was gone. Without a sound, without a trace. As if it had never been there. The scary traces. The next morning, I didn't go to work. I couldn't. I needed to know if it was real. I climbed up onto the roof again. This time, I saw more than just scratches. I saw footprints. The footprints weren't human, nor were they normal animal prints. They were too long, too misshapen, as if a large hand was walking with its fingers. The trail led from the top of the roof, extended to the right edge, and then disappeared abruptly, as if it had jumped down from above. But what chilled me most was something else. Something had used its claws to write a word on the roof. A single word, etched deep into the dust and moss. Look. It knew I had seen it. It knew I was looking for it. And perhaps it was looking for me too. I had no doubt about it. It wasn't a hallucination. It was real. I had seen it, felt its presence. And now it knew I was looking into it. I sat in my car, my eyes glued to the roof, where something had watched me from above last night. I could still remember the eyes that glowed like two reflective stones under the flashlight. The way it stood still, as if assessing me, then slowly disappeared into the darkness. But what I saw on the roof this morning, it really scared me. Footprints, scratches, and especially the word "sea" carved into the moss on the roof tiles. I have to leave. My first thought was to leave immediately. I'd heard similar stories. People saw something strange. They didn't leave, and then something bad happened. I didn't want to be part of that story. I hurried back into the house, grabbed my backpack, and stuffed it with a few clothes, my car keys, my wallet, and my phone. I didn't care about the things in the house. They weren't worth risking my life for. As I walked to the front door, about to run straight to the car, I stopped. The front door was open. I distinctly remembered locking it before I left this morning. I wasn't careless. I always locked my doors, but now it was ajar, as if someone had just walked in and hadn't closed it yet. Or maybe someone was still inside. I felt a chill run down my spine. The house was unusually quiet. No wind, no creaking of the wood floors, nothing. I walked slowly into the house, clutching the kitchen knife I'd left on the table since yesterday. I walked through the living room. Nothing had changed. I walked through the kitchen. Everything was just as I had left it. I looked up at the stairs leading to the second floor. Something was wrong. It felt like something was standing there, waiting for me to come up. And then I heard it. Clang, clack, clack. Footsteps, but they weren't human footsteps. They were too light, too sporadic, as if some creature was moving on all fours. I slammed the front door shut, locking it from the inside. I couldn't run away. If it was in the house, I couldn't let it follow me out. I had to face it now. Inside the house, I took a deep breath, raised my flashlight, and slowly walked up the stairs. With each step I took, the wooden floor made a slow creaking sound, as if the house were breathing with me. Upstairs, I looked toward the end of the hallway, where my bedroom door was. It was wide open. I never left my bedroom door open when I left the house. Light from the window streamed in, casting a long streak of light across the wooden floor. But the room was dark inside. I shined my flashlight inside. At first I saw nothing. Then I looked down at the floor. Something was crawling out from under the bed. My heart stopped. Long clawed fingers dug into the wooden floor, dragging a gaunt, misshapen body. It had no face, just a smooth head, with two eyes glowing like embers in the darkness. How long had it been there? I didn't have time to think. I yanked the knife from my hand and backed away. But it started moving, not running or jumping. It crawled, on all fours, like a spider. It came at me, its claws scraping the floor in the narrow hallway. I turned and ran. No escape. I ran straight down the stairs, feeling its cold breath behind me. I heard a wheezing, strange hissing sound. It didn't sound like human breathing. It sounded like something not of this world. I tripped on the bottom step, rolling to the floor. The impact was so hard my head was dizzy, but I couldn't stop. I staggered to my feet, trying to run to the front door. I searched my pocket for my keys. There were none. They were gone. I looked around. The keys were on the floor, right at the foot of the stairs, where the thing had crawled down. I had only one choice: I ran straight for the back door. I pounded on the lock, turning the knob over and over. It didn't open. I turned to look. It was crawling down the stairs, one step at a time, slowly, as if it knew I couldn't escape. I screamed, kicking with all my might on the back door. Bam! The door flew open. I rushed out, almost tripping over my own feet. I didn't dare turn around. I ran straight to the car, fumbled for the spare key in the glove compartment. My hands were shaking so much I could barely get it into the ignition. Finally, the engine started. I stepped on the gas and drove away from the house like a madman. It was still there. I don't know how far I drove. When I stopped, I was more than half a mile from the house. I sat in the car, panting, my mind blank. I looked in the rearview mirror. My house was still standing there in the dark, motionless, as if nothing had ever happened to it. But on the roof, right at the edge, I saw it, standing straight, looking my way. It knew I couldn't leave quite yet, and it knew I would come back. Story 6. The Shadow in the Mango Tree. I never thought a tree could scare me, but since moving into this house, I have begun to suspect that there are things beyond human understanding. The house I just moved into is in a small town in Florida. It is an old wooden house, about 3 miles from the center of town. It is surrounded by vast fields, and what makes this place special is the giant mango tree at the end of the garden. The mango tree looks very old. Its trunk is large, its bark is rough, and its branches stretch high, blocking out part of the sky. During the day, it is just an ordinary tree. But when night falls, the air around it becomes different. I moved here on a late summer afternoon. The sun was fading over the horizon, dyeing everything a reddish orange. When I first stepped into the backyard, I felt an odd silence. There were no birds, no wind rustling the leaves. Only the mango tree stood there, silent, but seemingly watching. The first night in the new house, I woke up around 2 a.m. I don't know why I woke up, but there was an uneasy feeling that kept me from falling back asleep. As I tried to turn over, a strange sound came from the backyard. It was a whisper. At first I thought someone was walking by the house, maybe a neighbor. But then I remembered. The nearest house was more than half a mile away. I pulled up the window blinds and looked out into the yard. The moonlight was dimly shining on the garden. Everything was the same, but then I realized that something was wrong. The mango tree was shaking, even though there was no wind. The leaves were swaying gently, as if something was crawling through the branches. I looked more closely. In the darkness of the tree, there was a shadow. It was unclear, just a vague shape, standing motionless under the tree. I tried to look longer, but in a split second, the shadow disappeared. I felt a chill run down my spine. I tried to convince myself that maybe it was just an illusion caused by the moonlight, or that I was too tired from moving all day. But the following nights, things only got worse. The whispering returned. At first, it was just a few incoherent sounds, indistinct words. But gradually, I began to hear broken sentences. Go away. Don't stay here. The voice didn't come from one direction. It echoed in the air, as if it came from everywhere around the mango tree. I couldn't sleep anymore. On the third night, I decided to do something stupid. I took the flashlight and went outside. The pale yellow light from the flashlight illuminated the damp grass under my feet. I walked slowly, step by step. A cold feeling enveloped me. As I approached the mango tree, everything suddenly became silent. No more insects, no more wind, nothing but the pounding of my heart in my chest. I raised the lamp. No one. But just as I was about to turn around and go back home, I felt a breath right behind me. I turned around, but there was nothing but the huge trunk of the mango tree. But on the trunk, there were marks of fingernails scratching, long, deep scratches into the wood, as if someone had tried to climb up or tried to escape. I took a step back, trying to calm myself. But then, a cold wind blew, and in that moment, I heard it. A voice right next to my ear. "Don't look up." Instantly, I felt my whole body freeze. But what is human instinct? When someone tells you not to look up, what do? I looked up, and that was my biggest mistake. On the highest branch, right in the middle of the black leaves, there was a face. It wasn't quite a human face. Deep black eyes, waxy skin, and a mouth that didn't move, but I knew it was smiling at me. I don't remember what I did next. I just remember running as fast as I could, not looking back, not daring to look again. As I slammed the door shut and locked all the bolts, I heard a low laugh drift through the air, as if it was enjoying itself. I woke up in the morning, sweating profusely, even though it wasn't hot. I considered calling the police or someone, but then I thought, what should I say? There's a face in my mango tree. I sighed, trying to calm myself down. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe the moonlight was creating an illusion. I decided to check the mango tree again during the day. When I walked out into the backyard, I saw that the mango tree was still standing there, calm and normal in the sunlight. But as I got closer, my heart stopped. On the trunk, the scratches I had seen last night were gone. In its place, there was a faint line of words carved into the bark, a single sentence. "We will meet again." That morning, I stood silently in front of the mango tree, staring at the words carved into the wood. "We will meet again." Who carved this? And more importantly, why did it appear so soon after last night? I tried to reassure myself. Maybe someone in town had played a prank on me. But that didn't explain the strange sounds, the whispers in the wind, or the face I had seen in the tree. I took a deep breath, took a few steps back, and quickly went back into the house, locking the back door. I had to figure this out. That afternoon, I drove to a small grocery store in town. The owner was an old man named Henry, who had lived here for nearly 50 years. If anyone knew about my house or the strange mango tree, it was him. I stood in front of the counter, pretending to pick up a few small items before asking in the calmest voice I could, "Mr. Henry, do you know anything about the house at the end of Cypress Street? I just moved there." Henry raised his head, his old eyes filled with thought. "Oh, that house? Are you new?" "Yes, it's quiet, but there's a huge mango tree in the backyard. It looks strange." Henry put the items down on the counter, his eyes darkening. "That mango tree? Have you heard anything?" I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do you mean?" Henry paused for a moment, then lowered his voice. "That tree, it's been out of order for a long time. There have been many families who lived in that house before, but they didn't stay long." I swallowed. "Because of the tree?" "I'm not sure. but I know people who have seen things that they shouldn't have. Voices in the night, shadows under the trees, and strange dreams. At the time, I didn't want to believe it, but what he said was so similar to what I had experienced. Who was the last person to live there? I asked. Henry looked out the window for a moment before answering. The Whitmores. The name sounded familiar, but I couldn't remember where I had heard it. I grabbed my shopping bag, thanked Henry, and left. As I walked out the door, he added, "If you hear the tree calling, never answer it." That night, I sat in the living room, looking out at the backyard. The tree was still there, its shadow spread out like a giant hand across the ground. I didn't want to go out. I didn't want to go near it again. Around 11 p.m., I turned off the lights and tried to fall asleep. But then, I started dreaming. In my dream, I was standing in the middle of the garden, right under the mango tree. The wind was blowing harder than usual, the mango leaves rustling against each other, making a rustling sound like a whisper. I couldn't move. Someone was standing behind me. I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck. A soft voice rang out right next to my ear. "You saw me, didn't you?" I wanted to turn around, but my body was held tight. "You looked up. You saw something you shouldn't have seen." Then I heard laughter. Not a normal laughter. It was twisted. It was unclear whether it was a man's or a woman's voice. It stretched out like a distorted melody of something that didn't belong to this world. I wanted to scream, but right then, I woke up. Sweat was pouring down my forehead. My heart was pounding wildly. I sat up straight, looking around the bedroom. Everything was the same, but something was wrong. My window was open. I distinctly remembered closing it before I went to sleep. I got out of bed, my heart pounding. I walked over to the window, looking out into the backyard. Underneath the mango tree, someone was standing there. I couldn't see the face clearly, but I knew it was looking at me. Then it started walking towards the house. I backed away, slammed the window shut, and pulled the curtains. I tried to breathe, tried to convince myself that this was just a long dream. But then, right outside the window, I heard a light knock. I froze. The knocking sounded again. Knock, knock, knock. I didn't dare open the curtains. Then, I heard laughter. It was the laughter from my dream. Then the whisper came, this time right next to my ear. Even though I was in my bedroom, completely alone. "We will meet again." I couldn't sleep that night. The knocking on the window and the whispering voice still echoed in my head, as if it wasn't just a sound, but something that seeped into my mind. I sat motionless on the bed, my back against the wall, my eyes not daring to leave the tightly closed window. The night outside was quiet, but I knew it was still there. The shadow under the mango tree. I didn't know how long I sat like that. It wasn't until the sky gradually brightened that I dared to let out a long breath. The air in the room still felt cold, and perhaps because of the excessive tension, I felt a sharp pain in the back of my head. I knew that I couldn't go on like this. I had to find out the truth about that mango tree. I remembered the name Whitmore that Mr. Henry had mentioned the day before. If anyone knew about the past of this house, I needed to find them. I drove to the town library, which held old records about the area. The librarian was an older woman, a little grumpy, but knowledgeable about local history. I walked up to the counter and asked, "Can you help me find information about a family that used to live down Cypress Street?" The Whitmores. She looked up at me for a long moment before answering. "Are you sure?" I nodded. "They lived there about 20 years ago," she said, her voice low. "But they left, or at least the survivors did." I felt a chill run down my spine. She walked over to an old bookshelf, leafing through a few files before pulling out a yellowed sheaf. "This is an old news report about the disappearance of Samuel Whitmore, the family's youngest son." I picked up the paper, my eyes glued to the headline, "9-year-old boy mysteriously misses at end of Cypress Street. No trace." I read each line, a heavy feeling creeping into my heart. Samuel Whitmore, 9, disappeared one summer night in 2002. He was last seen playing in his backyard. His parents said they heard footsteps and whispers in the yard in the middle of the night, but when they went outside to check, they found the back door wide open and the boy gone. All traces led to the large mango tree behind the house, but nothing unusual was found. The search lasted for weeks, but turned up nothing. Eventually, the Whitmore family left town and never returned. I clenched the paper in my hand. It was all too similar to what I had experienced. I left the library, my mind in turmoil. That evening, I decided to check out the mango tree again. But this time, I was more prepared. I grabbed a small knife, a powerful flashlight, and set my phone to video mode before stepping outside. The night sky was cloudless, but the air was unusually cold. As I approached the mango tree, the heavy feeling returned, as if I were entering a region that did not belong to this world. I shined the flashlight up the trunk. The words, "We will meet again," were still there. But right below it, there was a new mark, a handprint. Not the usual mud mark, but a deep imprint on the bark, as if someone had pressed their hand so hard into the wood that it left the shape of a finger. I shined the flashlight higher, feeling my chest being squeezed. I wasn't sure if it was the light, but the treetops. Something was moving. I tried to stay calm. I raised my phone, recorded the whole thing, and slowly stepped back. Then I heard it. Laughter. No longer a dream, no longer an illusion. Real laughter came from the trees. I turned the light up to the top of the tree, and this time, I could see the eyes. 2 black eye sockets stared down at me from between the branches. My legs felt weak. Without hesitation, I turned and ran straight into the house, slamming the door and locking all the latches. Outside, the laughter was still echoing. But this time, it was much closer. After catching my breath, I opened my phone and watched the video again. The image on the screen shook because my hand was unsteady. But I could still clearly see the tree, the words, the handprints, and something moving on the branches. I dragged the time bar, rewinding each frame, and then, at a certain moment, I saw it. A face. Not clearly, but enough to recognize. A pale face, empty black eyes, a crooked smile. It did not have the shape of a normal human. I felt my whole body go cold. I couldn't stay here any longer. I decided to call Henry, the grocery store owner. When I said I needed to see him immediately, his voice dropped. "You saw it, didn't you?" I bit my lip. "What was it?" Henry was silent for a few seconds, then said, "Not it, but they." I was stunned. They? "The souls trapped in that mango tree. You must leave before it's too late. Otherwise, you won't be yourself anymore." I felt goosebumps rising on my skin. Outside the window, I could see the treetops swaying slightly, even though there was no wind. And this time, I knew clearly that something was watching me. The call with Mr. Henry haunted me all night. It's not it, it's they. The spirits trapped in the mango tree. I didn't know if he was serious or not, but I couldn't deny what I had seen and heard in the past few days. I sat alone in the living room, my eyes glued to the glass door leading to the back garden. From here, I could clearly see that giant tree, standing tall in the darkness, its branches swaying gently as if whispering to someone. I didn't want to look at it anymore. I pulled down the curtains, locked all the doors, and went back to the bedroom. But I knew they were still there. I don't remember when I fell asleep, but I remember clearly the moment I woke up. At first, I thought I was still dreaming. I was standing under the mango tree in the thick darkness. There was no moonlight, no wind, only darkness surrounded me. Then I heard footsteps. Not just one person, but several. Pale shadows appeared under the trees. They had no faces, just empty shapes swaying in the darkness. One of them moved closer to me, then opened his mouth. "We were like you." The voice sounded like a distorted echo, overlapping each other. "You can't leave here. Never." Then I saw it. The pale face, the deep black eyes, the twisted smile. In the treetops. It slowly climbed down, branch by branch, until it was right in front of me. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream, but my feet felt like they were nailed to the ground. The shadow tilted its head. Its mouth moved slightly, but I couldn't hear anything. Then suddenly, it lunged at me. I woke up with a start, my whole body drenched in sweat. My breathing was labored, my heart pounding so hard I thought I was going to pass out. But the nightmare wasn't over. The whispering was still there. Not in the dream, just outside the bedroom door. I lay still, listening. The house was completely silent. I told myself I was imagining things. It must be the fear that had eaten into my mind. But then, something scratched lightly at my door. Once, twice, 3 times, slowly, rhythmically. I couldn't breathe. I lay still on the bed, not daring to move. Then I heard it. "Open the door." The voice wasn't loud, but it echoed throughout the room. I clenched my fists, trying not to make a sound. "Open the door, please." I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight with trembling hands, and gathered up all my courage to run to the door. No one was there, but on the wooden door, there were long, deep handprints, as if someone had gripped it from the outside. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers. I called Henry back the next morning. When I told him what had happened, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. Finally, he sighed. "You need to see someone." "Who?" "Lillian Whitmore." My heart pounded. "The missing boy's mother?" "Yes." Henry gave me her address. She lived in a small house on the outskirts of town, about a 15-minute drive from where I lived. I didn't hesitate. I had to know the truth. Lillian's house was small and modest, with a rose garden in front. I knocked on the door, my palms still damp from nervousness. A moment later, the door opened. An old woman with white hair and cold blue eyes stared at me. "You came for the tree, right?" I couldn't hide my surprise. She knew. I nodded. "I need to know what happened to Samuel." Lillian was silent for a moment, then turned and went inside. "Come in." I entered. The air in the house was cold. carrying the smell of old books and rotten wood. Lillian sat down on a chair, her eyes vacant as if recalling a distant memory. Samuel wasn't the first to disappear. I held my breath. What? She looked at me, her voice trembling slightly. There were other children before him. I felt a shiver run down my spine. They disappeared near that tree too? Yes. She paused, then continued. We thought it was just an ordinary tree. But we were wrong. Very wrong. She reached out and clutched the hem of her dress. That tree. It wasn't just a tree. I swallowed. Then what was it? Mrs. Lillian looked at me, her eyes suddenly empty. It was a trap. The air in the room became thick. She continued to whisper, her voice trembling, as if she was trying to fight off some invisible terror. Those who dare to look up at it will never escape. I felt my whole body go cold. Outside the window, the wind began to pick up. The branches of the mango tree were swaying. Lillian's words echoed in my head all day. It's a trap. I drove home, my mind racing. If what she said was true, then the mango tree was more than just an inanimate object. It was something alive, or worse. It was a portal, a prison for souls. I didn't want to believe it, but I couldn't deny what I'd experienced. The strange dreams, the whispers, the laughter, the shadow that appeared every night under the tree. And I looked up. I remembered Lillian's words. Those who dare look up at it will never escape. My stomach clenched. What if I had been chosen? What if I couldn't escape it now? I got home as the sun was setting over the horizon. Unease crept into my breath. I looked out into the backyard. The tree stood there, towering in the darkness. The leaves swayed slightly, despite the lack of wind. I don't know if it was the light, but the tree trunks felt larger than the day before. The branches stretched out longer, as if they were reaching for me. I turned away, trying not to panic. But then, I heard my name being called. The voice was a whisper, drawn out in the wind. Not from inside the house, not from outside the fence, but from above. My heart pounded. I tried not to turn around, not to look up. I remembered Lillian's warning, but that voice was my mother's. I froze in place. No, it couldn't be. My mother had died 3 years ago, but that voice, it was exactly like hers. Son, do you miss me? My lips trembled. No way. There was no way my mother could be here. But the voice continued. Look up. I'm here. My body went cold. I knew I mustn't look up. I'd heard the warnings, but what if it was really my mother? What if she was trapped in that tree? My hands clenched the arms of the chair, my nails digging into my palms. I mustn't look. I mustn't look. But then, a twisted laugh rang out in the darkness. It wasn't my mother's voice anymore. It was something else. It wasn't gentle anymore. It was twisted, like a dozen voices stacked on top of each other. You saw me. You think you can run? I couldn't take it anymore. I dashed inside the house, slammed the door, locked every bolt. I pulled down the curtains, turned off the lights, and tried to control the shaking that gripped my body. Outside, the whispering continued. You saw me. Don't try to hide. You're mine. I covered my ears, squeezed my eyes shut. But the voice wasn't coming from outside anymore. It was coming from inside the house. I jumped up, ran to the bedroom, and locked the door. But as soon as I turned around, I saw it. There were handprints on the ceiling. They were imprinted deep into the white paint, fingers unnaturally long. Not the prints of a normal person. These were dry black hands that looked like they had been burned. I felt my whole body shaking. I didn't know what to do. All I knew was this: I wasn't safe anymore. I lay awake that night, huddled in bed, staring at the bedroom door. I couldn't hear anything, but I knew it was still there. The next morning, I went to see Lillian again. When she opened the door, I could see the worry in her eyes. "You heard it, didn't you?" she asked. I nodded, my voice hoarse. "I heard it, and I saw it." Mrs. Lillian sighed, then pulled me into the house. She led me to a small room in the back, filled with old photographs. "That tree, it's not just a trap," she whispered. I looked at her, waiting. "It's a door." I frowned. A door? A door that leads to where? Mrs. Lillian looked at me for a long time, then said slowly, "To the place where souls cannot leave." She pointed to an old photograph on the table, a photo of a mango tree from many years ago. But what made my skin crawl was, on the tree, hidden among the leaves, there were faces, dozens, even hundreds of faces. All had the same expression: empty eyes, a crooked smile. My heart was pounding. Mrs. Lillian put her hand on my shoulder, squeezing it tightly. "If you don't leave soon, you'll become a part of it." I felt a chill run down my spine. I had to leave this place immediately, but do I really have a chance to escape? Story 7. The Child's Call in the Night. I started hearing the voice about 2 weeks ago. Faint, distant, as if coming from somewhere else, shrouded in the fog of sleep. At first, it was just a faint sound, a soft call mixed in with the fragments of my dreams that I barely remembered when I woke up. But it grew louder, becoming clearer each night. "Mom?" I woke up with a start in the middle of the night. The room was empty, lit only by the dim glow of the digital clock on the nightstand. 3:12 a.m. My apartment was strangely quiet. I was used to the quiet of this place, a small apartment complex in suburban New York, where neighbors rarely bothered each other. But tonight, the silence carried an unnameable unease, as if something was waiting for me just outside my bedroom door. I tried to push the feeling away and forced myself to lie down, pulling the covers up high, reassuring myself that it was just a dream. But deep down, I knew the voice was no longer just part of a harmless dream. It was becoming more real. Walking in the hallway. The next morning, I woke up feeling strange, tired and disoriented, as if I hadn't slept at all. My mind was blank, but there was a dull, heavy feeling in my chest. I tried to remember the dream I'd had last night, but all that remained was a small call and the vague image of a small hand touching my arm. Shaking my head to clear the thoughts, I pulled myself out of bed and walked into the living room. And that's when I saw it. The high chair, lying right on the dining table, as if it had always been there. I was stunned, my eyes widening. I didn't have children. I had never been pregnant. I had never bought or brought home a child's chair. And yet, there it was. A small white wooden chair with a soft pale blue cushion, completely out of place in my simple interior. My fingers trembled as I touched it, cold and smooth, as if it had just been brought in from outside. I immediately searched the apartment, checking the doors and windows. They were all locked, with no signs of forced entry. No strange footprints, no trace of anyone having entered. It was just me and that chair. The dreams were different that night. I locked the front door, blocking it with a chair to make sure no one could sneak in. I closed the windows and drew the curtains, the feeling of being watched growing stronger. Night fell quickly. The darkness in the apartment was thicker than usual. I tried to read, watch TV, do anything to keep myself busy, but everything was meaningless when the call rang out again. Mom. This time, I did not wake up immediately. I was trapped in a strange dream. A small room, filled with a cold grey-blue light, like moonlight shining through a glass door. In the middle of the room, there was a crib. I walked slowly towards it, my heart pounding in my chest. Something was moving inside. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop. A pair of round black eyes looked up at me from the crib. A pair of small, immature eyes, but too deep like a dark abyss. Mom! I screamed and woke up. Cold sweat broke out on my forehead, my nightgown soaked. The room was dark, but I knew something was wrong. I turned on the bedside lamp, scanning the room. No one, nothing out of the ordinary. But then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The bedroom door was ajar. Someone is here. I distinctly remembered closing the door before I went to sleep. I always did. But now, it was open just enough to let me see the darkness outside in the hallway. I clutched the covers tighter, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no other sound, but I could feel it. An invisible presence, something waiting. I forced myself to calm down, reaching for the phone on the table. I considered calling the police, but then stopped. What would I tell them? That I heard a voice in my dream? That I saw a baby seat mysteriously appear? They would just think I was overstressed. Taking a deep breath, I slid out of bed and headed for the door. My hands shook as I grasped the handle, slowly pulling it open. The hallway was empty. I went through each room, checking each door, each hidden corner. No one was there. No sign of anything unusual. There was only one thing. The high chair had been pulled away from the table. It was no longer close to the table, but pushed away, as if someone had sat in it. Answer unsolved. I couldn't sleep all night. I sat in the chair, hugging myself, staring at the high chair, as if it might move at any moment. I had to find out the truth. The next morning, I went to see a psychiatrist, trying to explain my condition without sounding like a lunatic. But even as they suggested, it was just some sort of sleep disorder. I knew the truth wasn't that simple. The chair was still there. The dreams were getting clearer, and that voice was no longer just a call. It began to whisper in the night. Mommy, don't leave me. I didn't know who the child was, but I knew it was coming. I didn't sleep. All night, I just sat there, staring at the baby chair in front of the dining table, as if I took my eyes off it, something would change. My apartment was as quiet as ever, but the unsettling feeling wouldn't go away. Something was wrong. I could feel it. An invisible presence. Something not of this world was watching me. But I didn't know who it was, or what it wanted. The appearance of the traces. The next morning, I tried to make things as normal as possible. I took a cold shower, made a strong cup of coffee, and then tried to clean up the apartment to dispel the heavy feeling in my heart. But when I returned to the kitchen, the baby chair had changed position. This time, it was no longer facing the dining table. It was facing me. My whole body froze. a chill running down my spine. I remembered very clearly that I had not touched it, had not touched it even once since last night. I checked the front door. It was still locked. The window? Same. Who could have done this? I swallowed, trying to calm myself. Maybe I was too stressed or too sleep deprived, making me confused. I forced myself to think that. But as I approached the chair, I noticed something else. Tiny fingerprints on the white wood. I shuddered and backed away. It couldn't be. I lived alone. How could there be childish fingerprints in this apartment? I left the apartment immediately, not caring that I was still wearing my wrinkled pajamas or that it was freezing outside. I needed to get out. I needed air. I needed to get out of that apartment. The encounter with a strange woman. I went to a nearby coffee shop, ordered a hot espresso, and sat quietly in the corner, trying to calm down. But even though I had left the apartment, the feeling of being watched did not leave me. And then I felt someone watching me. I looked up. A middle-aged woman, thin with grayish-brown hair tied in a bun, was watching me from the table across from her. She did not take her eyes off me, as if waiting for something. When she realized I had seen her, she picked up her teacup and walked towards me. "Sorry if I scared you." Her voice was soft, but there was something heavy in each word. But I thought, you needed help. I leaned back slightly, alert. "Who are you?" I asked. "My name is Margaret. I've lived in this apartment building for over 30 years. I frowned. I'd never seen her before. But before I could ask any more questions, she leaned down and whispered something that took my breath away. "You saw it, right? The child in the dream." I couldn't speak. My hand tightened around my coffee cup, trying not to spill it. How did she know? What did she know? Margaret sighed at my reaction. She pulled up a chair across from me, then continued softly. "That child doesn't belong to this world. It was once a part of someone, but now it's trapped. And when it starts appearing in someone's dreams, it means..." She paused, her eyes flashing with regret. "It means it chose you." The forgotten past, I didn't understand what she was saying. I couldn't. But part of me felt like this wasn't just a passing dream anymore. That child, it was real. It wasn't just a dream. It was getting closer. I asked Margaret what she knew about it, but she just shook her head. "You have to find out for yourself, Emily. It will lead you where it wants you to go. But remember, if it calls you mother, it means that part of it is in you." I didn't understand what she meant. Was part of it in me? I left the cafe with a heavy heart, unable to shake Margaret's words from my mind. Was there something in my past that I didn't remember? Something that was forgotten? I needed to find out. I needed to find out the truth. The signs were increasingly clear. That night, I returned to the apartment with heightened vigilance. I checked every corner, every window. Nothing had changed. But when I entered the bedroom, I froze. There was something on the bed. A small, shabby brown teddy bear lay in the middle of the white sheet. I didn't have it. I never bought it. But I knew who it belonged to. When I touched the teddy bear, a flood of memories came flooding back. A sharp pain in my head made me stagger. The faint image of a small child, round black eyes, a childish smile, a giggling laugh echoed in my mind, but I didn't know who it was. That memory. Was it mine or someone else's? Just then, I heard footsteps. Not in the dream. There was really someone in the apartment. I turned around. The bedroom door slowly opened, and standing there, in the darkness of the hallway, was a small figure. The dim light from the nightlight illuminated its eyes, round, black, deep, and this time, I didn't just hear the call in my dream. It whispered, right in front of me. "Mom, I found you." I stood there frozen. The small figure in front of the bedroom door didn't move. The yellow light from the nightlight illuminated a pair of deep black eyes, round and soulless like two dark holes. "Mom, I found you." The whisper sounded like the wind whistling through the crack in the door, so small that it almost blended into the air. But I heard it clearly. Every word. My heart pounded in my chest, as if it wanted to break out of my ribcage. I stepped back reflexively, my eyes not leaving the figure in front of me. I wanted to scream, to run away, to do anything to escape this thing, but my legs were frozen. I couldn't move. It was real. It wasn't a dream. The child's figure stood there silently, just a few steps away from me. I could see it more clearly now. A thin figure, skin as pale as wax, messy black hair. It wore an old mud-stained nightgown. But the most terrifying thing was its eyes. No pupils, no reflection. Two black holes. It wasn't human. I had to do something. I had to get out of this situation. I took a step back with all my might, my hand fumbling for the phone on the nightstand. My fingers trembled as I dialed, but before I could call, the room went dark. Darkness takes over. The nightlight went out. Darkness came, thick and heavy, like a giant blanket covering me. The room was plunged into a dark void, where there was no light, no sound, just me and the child. My breathing quickened, my heart pounding like a drum in my chest. I couldn't see anything. No window, no bed, no nightlight, no child. But I felt it, somewhere nearby. A whisper sounded right next to my ear. "Don't be afraid, Mom." Cold air blew against the back of my neck. It was right behind me. I turned around quickly, but there was nothing. Just solid black. But when I turned back, it was right in front of me. So close that I could see the cracks in its skin, like cracks on an old porcelain doll. It tilted its head, its empty eyes looking straight at me. And then slowly, it smiled. The smile was crooked, stretching all the way to its ears. "Did you miss me, Mom?" I couldn't take it anymore. I screamed, groping for the light switch. And then, the light turned on, the darkness disappeared. The room returned to normal. There was no one there. No child. The undeniable trace. My whole body shook. I rushed to the door, flipping every light switch in the apartment, letting the light dispel the fear that was rising in my heart. My breathing quickened, my chest heaving violently. Am I hallucinating? No. Something had happened. I was sure of it. I scanned the room to check everything was in place. Nothing had been disturbed. But when I returned to the bed, the teddy bear, it was no longer in the middle of the bed like before. It had been pulled to the edge of the bed, as if someone had picked it up and left it there. I swallowed. Someone had obviously touched it. The buried truth. I couldn't stand another night in this apartment. The next morning, I went to find Margaret, the middle-aged woman I'd met in the coffee shop. If anyone knew what was going on, it was her. She lived in an old apartment downstairs, one that smelled of rotting wood and had thick curtains that blocked out the sunlight. When I told her what had happened, her face became serious. "It came into this world," she said, her voice low. You opened the door for it. Opened the door? I shuddered. What do you mean? She looked at me with pity in her eyes. It chose you, and you accepted it. I didn't do anything, I snapped. Did you touch anything? Something that didn't belong to you? I was speechless. The teddy bear. I touched it. I held it. Margaret nodded, as if she understood everything. This thing isn't a dream. It's a forgotten soul and it wants a mother. You gave it a chance. I felt like someone was squeezing my chest. No, it couldn't be. But deep down, I knew. From the moment I touched the teddy bear, everything had changed. A dream came true again that night. I decided to do something bold. I put the teddy bear in the middle of the living room. I turned on all the lights, and I grabbed a small knife. I didn't know what it was for, but I felt like I needed something to protect myself. I sat down on the couch, eyes fixed on the bear. I would wait. Wait to see what it would do next. And then, at 3:12 a.m., the exact time I usually woke up from my dreams, the lights flickered out. Not all of them, just the living room light. The lights in the other rooms were still on. But in the darkness of the living room, I could see it clearly. The child. He was sitting on the couch, right across from me. He held the teddy bear to his chest, his eyes looking straight at me. His mouth moved wordlessly, but I understood what he was saying. Mommy, I'm cold. I froze, and then, for the first time, he got off the couch. He walked toward me. I couldn't move. The child was walking toward me, slowly across the wooden floor, making no sound. It still held the teddy bear tightly to its chest, its jet black eyes never leaving me. The room was so quiet that I could hear my heart pounding in my chest. My instincts told me to run immediately, but my feet felt like they were glued to the floor. I couldn't take my eyes off it. Mom, I'm cold. The whisper left its lips, echoing throughout the apartment like an echo from somewhere far away. No, not from here. Not from this world. I swallowed, forcing myself to think logically. But how could I, when the thing in front of me didn't belong to any logic I knew? It wasn't a dream. It had truly entered this world. I tightened my grip on the knife in my hand, as if by reflex. But I knew that if this thing was truly a forgotten soul, a normal knife wouldn't be able to do anything. It stopped less than a foot away from me. Then suddenly, it raised its head and looked at me. Don't you remember me? I felt an invisible hand tighten around my throat. Part of me wanted to scream, I'm not your mother. But that voice, it carried something terrifyingly familiar. I had heard it before. Somewhere. Somewhere I couldn't remember. The darkness flows. The air in the apartment grew heavier. I felt a chill creeping into every cell of my body, an indescribable fear. Unconsciously, I glanced at the clock on the wall. 3:12 a.m. In that moment, I remembered Margaret's words. It will take you where it wants you to go. But remember, if it calls you mother, it means a part of it is inside you. A part of it? Inside me? I felt like my head was spinning. I couldn't remember anything. I couldn't remember. But if what Margaret said was true, what did that mean? Suddenly the child reached out. Mommy, I'm cold. Hold me. I froze. I didn't want to touch it. But a strange cold wind blew into the room, even though all the windows were closed. The walls shook slightly, as if an invisible earthquake was radiating from where the child stood. It didn't just want me to touch it. It was forcing me to. The door between two worlds. Just when I thought I was about to lose control, there was a knock on the door. Thump, 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 thump. I jumped. Who would come to the apartment at 3 a.m.? I looked at the child. He was no longer in front of me. I turned. The front door was ajar. It was dark outside. No hallway, no lights. Nothing. Just an endless void. The darkness beyond the door was thick, deep, and bottomless. I sensed something moving inside. A pale, bony hand reached out from the darkness and rested on the edge of the door. Then another hand, and a head. I couldn't scream. The creature had no face. It was blank, lifeless, like an old statue worn away by time. But I could feel its gaze, even though it had no eyes. It lowered its head, looking straight at me. And then it smiled. A smile that stretched from ear to ear. Inhuman. I finally found you. I backed away but couldn't take my eyes off it. Suddenly, a small hand grabbed my wrist. I spun around. The child was standing right next to me. But this time, its eyes weren't empty. I looked into them, and I remembered everything. The truth in memory. A hospital, a heart-wrenching pain. A scream, a white room. I had given birth to a child. But I had forgotten it. Forgotten it all. I didn't remember its face. Didn't remember its first cry. Didn't remember anything. How could this be? Its small hand tightened around my wrist, pulling me back to reality. The child wasn't scary anymore. It was crying. Mommy, I don't want to go with it. The darkness from the door began to spread, as if it wanted to swallow the entire apartment. I had two choices. Step into the darkness, where the faceless creature waited, or save this child. The child I had forgotten. I didn't know what I had done in the past, but I knew one thing. I would not let it be taken from me again. Get out of the house, a voice called from behind. I turned. Margaret was standing right in front of the window, her face tense. Run, Emily. Don't let it pull you in. The darkness was getting closer. Without thinking, I picked up the child. She wasn't as cold as before. I rushed toward Margaret as soon as I stepped out of the apartment. The door behind me slammed shut. Screams echoed from inside. Not mine, not the child's, but the thing in the darkness. Margaret pulled me away from the apartment. I turned my head one last time, and I saw that my apartment was no longer there. In its place, there was only an empty space, darkness, thick, endless, and a voice echoed from within. Next time, you won't escape. I no longer had an apartment. It was gone. As soon as I stepped through the door, with Margaret and the child, all that was left behind was empty darkness, an endless black hole into which all light and sound were sucked. As if my apartment had never existed. I couldn't breathe. How long had I been there? Was it a week? A month? A few nights? I didn't know. All notions of time seemed to have been distorted since I'd first heard the voice in my dreams. Beside me, the child held my hand tightly, its black eyes staring at me with fear. It was no longer a lifeless ghost. Since I accepted it, since I realized I had a child, it began to take on a clearer shape. But I still couldn't remember anything about it. I didn't know its name. I didn't remember the day it was born. I didn't remember it ever being in my life. How could I forget my child? I turned to Margaret, still panting after dragging me out of the apartment. She knew more than she let on. What's going on? I asked, my voice hoarse. Why did my apartment disappear? Why don't I remember anything about this child? Margaret looked at me, her eyes tired and worried. Emily, You didn't just forget it, she whispered. You were forced to forget. Stolen memories. We sat in Margaret's apartment, a cramped but warm place, the complete opposite of the emptiness I had just escaped. The child hugged the teddy bear, sitting silently on the chair, as if she were also trying to understand what was going on. Margaret placed a cup of hot tea in front of me, then sat down across from me. Emily, have you lived here long? I frowned. That question was off. Of course, I've lived here for more than 3 years. My words trailed off. More than 3 years? But I couldn't remember anything about the first year. A chill ran down my spine. All I could remember was the past 2 years. My new job, my tiring days at work, my boring life. But the time before that was completely blank. No image, no memory, nothing. I stared at the child. It was looking at me too, as if waiting for me to realize something. I suddenly remembered the dreams. The child calling me mother. The cries in the night, the laughter from the cradle. Did I live with it? My hands trembled. Margaret placed a thin hand on my shoulder. You understand, don't you? She said softly. It's not a ghost. It's not from the other world. It's always been here. It belongs to you. But why did I forget it? Because someone forced you to forget the truth in the old records. I couldn't sit still. I needed proof. I needed to find out who I had been before. The next morning, Margaret and I went to the city hall where the resident records were kept. I told the clerk that I wanted to look up my rental history on the pretext that I needed the records to resolve some administrative issues. As the clerk ran the system, I could see the color drain from his face. Apartment 3 or 4, he muttered. That's strange. There's no record. I felt my heart sink. There's no record. I tried to keep my voice calm. There would, but only 2 years ago. He turned the screen toward me. Before that, apartment 3 or 4 was completely absent from the system. I couldn't believe my eyes. How could an apartment not exist? Margaret was silent beside me, but I knew she wasn't surprised. I asked, So who rented it before I lived there? The clerk shook her head. No one. It was vacant. But I knew it was a lie. I had lived there, and I hadn't lived there alone. A warning from a stranger. I didn't stop there. I needed more. I went to the nearest hospital where my medical records might be. If I had ever had children, there would be traces. But as I entered the hospital's administrative area, I suddenly felt someone following me. I turned around. A man in a black coat stood at the end of the hallway, looking straight at me. When I met his eyes, he shook his head slightly, as if warning me not to continue. I felt my hand go cold. Someone didn't want me to remember. I hurried out of the hospital, feeling an invisible string tightening around me. When I got back to the car, Margaret asked, Did you find anything? I shook my head, but I knew I had found the most important thing. I had a child, and someone had tried to erase its existence. The horror that night, I couldn't sleep. I held the child tightly, feeling its faint warmth. It was no longer a ghost. It was slowly coming back to this world, but I knew I was being watched. The shadows under the window, the footsteps in the hallway at midnight. They knew I was remembering. They wouldn't let me continue. And then, a knock, 3 slow knocks echoing through the night. I held the child close, my heart pounding in my chest. Margaret looked at me, her eyes worried. They're here. Story 8. Voice from screen. Every night, As his apartment plunged into darkness, he heard it. At first, Caleb thought he was imagining it, a simple auditory hallucination brought on by fatigue from long hours at the office. But as it continued, night after night, he knew something was wrong. The voice came from the television. He lived alone in a small apartment in the suburbs of Portland, Oregon. It was quiet, with few people around, and his neighbors hardly ever bothered each other. Caleb liked the isolation. No one bothered him, no one prying into his private life. But that isolation left him feeling naked when he realized that something, or someone, was in his apartment every night. The first time he heard the whispering, it was around 2 a.m. Caleb woke up with a start, not knowing why. The apartment was completely dark, except for the faint light from outside filtering in through the windows. His heart was pounding, not from the nightmare, but from the vague feeling that something had woken him. Then he heard it. A voice, as soft as a breath, came from the living room. He frowned, sitting up, listening. The sound was coming from the television in the living room. An odd fact, since Caleb was sure he turned it off before going to bed. But now it was emitting an unintelligible murmur. Not a movie, not a commercial. Just a low, broken murmur, as if someone were whispering into his ear through the screen. He jumped up barefoot across the cold wooden floor and headed toward the living room. When he got there, he immediately reached for the remote and pressed the off button. The television screen went black. No sound. Caleb stood in the darkness, trying to calm himself. Maybe it was just a technical glitch, or maybe he'd fallen asleep with the TV on. He went back to bed, trying to fall back asleep, but his sleep that night was far from peaceful. The blurry images, the faceless figures, and the whispering still echoed in his head. The next night, it happened again. This time, Caleb was sure he'd turned the TV off before going to bed. He even unplugged it to make sure it couldn't turn itself on. But at 3 a.m., he heard it again. The whispering, quiet, but clearer. His heart clenched as he looked down the dark hallway to the living room. He didn't want to go there, but at the same time, he couldn't ignore it. The feeling that something was happening in his own apartment that he couldn't control made him shiver. He grabbed his phone, turned on the flashlight, and slowly made his way to the living room. The TV was still off. The black screen reflected his image. But the whispering continued, quieter, as if it were waiting for him to come closer. He turned on the light. No one was there. But as soon as the light came on, the whispering stopped. Caleb stood there for a long moment, his hand clutching the phone, his ears pricked up in anticipation. There was only silence and his own rapid breathing. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was watching him from within the black screen. This time, he didn't just unplug it. He covered the TV screen with a large cloth, as if to hide whatever horror was lurking inside. He didn't sleep that night. After 3 nights of strange things happening, Caleb decided to check the security cameras in his house. He'd installed them for practical reasons, to protect his property, to guard against burglars. But when he reviewed the footage from last night, his blood ran cold. At 3 a.m., he found himself walking out of his bedroom, but he had no memory of it. In the video, Caleb appeared with dreamy eyes, his face expressionless, like a sleepwalker. He walked straight to the television, reached out and turned it on. The screen lit up, but there was no image, just a white static screen. Then he started talking. For 2 hours, Caleb stared at the screen, his mouth moving as if he were talking to someone. But there was no one there. There was no sound from the television, no other voices. Just him, sitting there, nodding, smiling, and occasionally nodding as if responding to an invisible conversation. He fast-forwarded the video, hoping to see the moment he returned to bed. But what was even more horrifying was that just as the clock on the camera jumped to 5 a.m., Caleb in the video suddenly turned around, looking straight into the lens. The smile stretched across his face. Then, the screen went black. Caleb felt a chill run down his spine. He checked the entire video, but at that moment, the feed was cut off. There was no image. A chill ran down his spine. Who or what had interrupted the recording? And more importantly, who had he been talking to for 2 hours that he had no recollection of? Caleb couldn't go on without finding answers. He began digging deeper into the origins of the television, the apartment, and even the strange events that had occurred in the area. And he discovered something. This apartment wasn't the first place this had happened. 10 years ago, in another house in the city, a man had been found dead, sitting in front of his television. The screen was still on, and there was a faint smile on his face. The scariest thing? There was no sign that he had ever gotten up from his chair in the 3 days before his death. Caleb shivered, feeling as if some invisible string was tightening around him. What had he gotten himself into? And more importantly, if he continued, would he ever be able to escape? Caleb couldn't sleep. Not that he didn't want to. His body was exhausted, his eyelids heavy. But every time he closed his eyes, the video played in his head. The image of himself sitting in front of the TV, whispering to something invisible on the black screen. Then the final moment when he suddenly turned to look at the camera, a ghostly smile on his face. He couldn't remember anything. He tried to make sense of it all. Maybe he had a sleep disorder, sleepwalking, or maybe it was the stress of being alone for so long. But that didn't explain the sound he heard every night. Didn't explain why the camera feed cut out the moment he turned to look directly at it. And most importantly, who had he been talking to for 2 hours? Wednesday night, Caleb didn't turn on the TV, didn't unplug it. He even took it out of the living room, put it in a corner of the small storage room behind the kitchen. But just as the clock struck 3 a.m., he woke up. The whispering continued. There was no TV in the living room, no screen lit, but the whispering still echoed from the wall, from the empty space where the TV had stood. This time, he heard it more clearly. It was no longer a meaningless sound, but actual words, a deep, distorted voice, whispering as if through a layer of electronic noise. "Caleb, are you listening?" His whole body froze. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't move. The whispering continued. "We talked. You promised. Have you forgotten?" Caleb's throat was dry. His heart pounded in his chest. For the first time in 4 nights, he felt a primal fear slowly grip his mind. He had never promised anything to it. He couldn't remember anything. But even so, the strange sense of familiarity lingered in his mind. Trying to suppress his fear, Caleb turned on the lights and walked slowly toward the living room. No TV, no one. But the whispering didn't stop. This time, he took out his phone, opened the security camera app, and watched the live feed from the living room. The image appeared immediately, and on the phone screen, He saw himself, not the present, but the Caleb of some other reality, sitting on the sofa, facing the TV that was still in the room, the screen emitting a pale light. He was talking, whispering to someone who didn't exist. His heart almost stopped. It was a recording, a part of last night that the camera had lost? No, that couldn't be. This was a live feed. He looked around the living room. It was completely empty. But on the phone screen, there was another version of him, sitting there. Then the Caleb on the camera turned around, looking straight at him. The smile was still there. He dropped the phone. The image faded. After that terrifying moment, Caleb decided to leave the apartment for a few days. He needed time to think, to get away from the obsession that was haunting him. He went to Ethan's house, an old friend from college. Ethan worked in tech and was the type of guy who could explain everything with science. When Caleb told him the whole story, Ethan couldn't hide his skepticism. Maybe it was just some kind of sleepwalking or auditory hallucination, Ethan said, handing Caleb a cup of coffee. Do you have a history of sleepwalking? No, Caleb said. I've never sleepwalked or anything like that. But Ethan, I have the video. The camera caught me talking to the screen. Ethan frowned. Do you have it? Caleb nodded, pulling out his phone. But when he opened the camera app and found the video he'd saved, it was gone. No trace. He was sure he'd downloaded it, kept it in a private folder. But now, it was all gone. I saved it, Caleb muttered. It's here. Ethan looked at him with concern. Maybe you're mistaken? No, Caleb said, his voice growing cold. I know I saved it. Ethan was silent for a long moment, then sighed. Okay, if you want, I can come to your apartment tonight. I'll check the cameras, check the network. If anything happens, at least you'll have a witness. Caleb thought for a moment, then nodded. He didn't want to go back to the apartment, but if Ethan came with him, maybe he could find some answers. 3 a.m. They sat in the living room, waiting. The TV was still in storage, but the air in the apartment was different. Like it knew they were there. Like it was waiting. Ethan checked his laptop, taking notes. No electromagnetic interference. No signs of anyone hacking into the system. Just a normal apartment. The room went dark. Everything fell into darkness. The TV was unplugged, but it was on. The screen showed no clear image, just a black and white noise storm. But between the lines, running across it, a figure appeared. Blurry, but slowly, it became clearer. It was Caleb, not the current him, but another version. A distorted, twisted image, with empty eyes and a mouth that moved constantly. We talked. You promised. Ethan dropped his coffee cup to the floor, but Caleb couldn't take his eyes off the screen. The Caleb on the TV looked straight at him. Then it smiled. A smile that wasn't human. The screen flickered. The room went dark again. Ethan turned on the flashlight, gasping for air. What the hell just happened? Caleb didn't answer, because just then, the TV turned on again, and from inside, a cold, hoarse voice whispered, You promised, Caleb. It's time to remember. I never promised it anything. But the TV didn't think so. It reminded me. Ethan stood next to me, pale, the light from his flashlight shaking as it swept across the room. The coffee cup shattered on the floor, dark drops of liquid streaking across the carpet. The TV continued to play strange noises, a sound somewhere between static and someone's heavy breathing. There was no clear image, just thick darkness. But then, through the grey-white static, a face appeared. It was me, but not me now. The face looked paler, the eye sockets sunken, the skin stretched as thin as plastic over my skull. I was staring at myself through the screen, not blinking, not moving. Ethan took a step back. "Caleb, turn it off." I wanted to. I really did. But I couldn't move. A strange feeling spread through my head, as if a memory had just surfaced from the depths of my mind. A memory I didn't remember having. "You promised." The voice came from the television. This time, I heard it more clearly. I knew the voice. It was mine. I don't remember when I started crying. It was only when Ethan tugged on my arm that I realized my eyes were wet. I couldn't explain the feeling, as if there was something very important that I had forgotten. Something that I shouldn't have forgotten. But Ethan was impatient to wait for me to find an answer. "I can't take it anymore," he said, hurrying over to the television. "What the hell is going on here?" Before I could react, Ethan reached down and pulled the plug out of the socket. There was a moment of suffocating silence. Then the screen went black. Nothing happened. No whispers, no shadows. Just an old television sitting quietly in the middle of the room. Ethan breathed a sigh of relief, but I stood still. I didn't believe it was that simple. "Caleb?" Ethan called, his voice still shaking. "Are you okay?" I didn't answer, because at that moment, in the darkness reflected on the black screen, I saw something standing behind me. I didn't remember how I turned on the light. I only remembered that when the light filled the room, it was gone. There was no one behind me, nothing in the darkness. But the feeling was still there. The feeling that I was no longer alone. Ethan looked as panicked as I did. "You really should leave," he said, his eyes never leaving the TV. It could be something psychological, or it could be something else. "But you can't stay here alone." I knew he was right. But there was a part of me, a part I didn't understand, that didn't want to leave. I wanted to know what I'd promised. I wanted to know who'd been talking to me every night. And most importantly, I wanted to know what I'd forgotten. Ethan left that night. I didn't blame him. If I hadn't been the one to experience it firsthand, I probably would have done the same thing. But I didn't leave. Instead, I did something I couldn't explain. I dragged the TV to the middle of the room. I retrieved the remote, and I turned it on. 3 a.m. The screen flickered, and then an image appeared. Not me, not my ghostly face from the previous video, but an old room with cracked walls and flashing neon lights. It wasn't my apartment. I didn't know where it was. But a strange feeling filled my mind. I had been there before. On the screen, the door to the room slowly opened. A figure walked in. A man with a familiar appearance. But it wasn't me. It was someone else. Someone who looked like me. He stood in the middle of the room, staring straight at the TV screen. He didn't blink. He didn't move. Then his lips moved. There was no sound. I couldn't hear what he was saying. But I understood. Even without sound, I understood what he was saying. A sentence repeated over and over. A sentence that even without hearing it, I could still feel. Don't forget. Don't forget. Don't forget. I felt a wave of dizziness wash over me. I blinked, trying to stay conscious, but the room began to spin. The picture on the TV faded. I felt like I was falling, but not to the ground, into the screen. I woke up on the floor, cold sweat soaking my back. The TV was off. The apartment was completely silent, but I wasn't the Caleb I'd been before. I remembered. I knew what I'd promised. And I knew that I can't escape anymore. I remember. Not all of it. Not every detail. But I remember being there. The room on the screen. The cracked walls. The flashing neon lights. And the man who looked like me. He stood there, looking at me through the screen, his lips moving a single sentence. Don't forget. Don't forget. Don't forget. I don't know how I forgot. But now the memories began to rise from the depths of my mind, like a nightmare locked away for so long, trying to spill out. I couldn't escape anymore. I had to know what I had promised. I didn't leave my apartment for 3 days. I didn't sleep. I didn't shower. I barely ate. I spent all my time sitting in front of the television, but it didn't play anything anymore. Every time I turned it on, it was just a black screen. No voice, no picture. But I knew it was watching me, not through the screen, through other things, through the bathroom mirror, where I could see my reflection. Wasn't as I remembered it, through the fitful naps when I felt someone standing right next to my bed, through the nighttime jolts when I realized the TV was on, even though I clearly remembered unplugging it. The memories weren't quite there yet, but I knew there was a way to remember. I needed to go back to where it all started. Portland, Oregon. 5 years ago, I never really wanted to remember this time. I was a college student, struggling with money and debt. I rented a small apartment in an older neighborhood where the rent was cheaper. The apartment had an old TV. I don't remember buying it. I don't remember how I got there. It just appeared in my room one day, as if it had always been there, and I turned it on. At first it worked fine. The boring news channels, movies, commercials. But sometimes, at night, when I was flipping through the channels, I saw things that shouldn't be on TV. Not movies, not TV shows, but a room, exactly like the room in the video I saw a few days ago. At the time, I didn't think much of it. I just assumed it was some strange channel, some kind of art show. But I remember the first time I saw myself on the screen. And I remember talking to it. Now I tremble as the memories become clearer. I sat down in front of that old TV many nights in a row. I don't remember exactly what I said, but I know that I had a conversation. I promised something. And now it was coming back to make me keep my word. I decided to do something crazy. I would talk to it again. That night, I got everything ready. I put the old TV back in the living room. I plugged it in. I turned off all the lights in the apartment. I sat down and I turned the TV on. The screen was still pitch black, no static, no whispers. I waited 5 minutes, 10 minutes. When the clock struck 3:08 a.m., everything changed. The TV screen lit up. This time I didn't see the old room. I saw a long dark hallway, cold concrete walls. The floor was covered in black scorch marks. At the end of the hallway, there was a metal door. I didn't know where this place was. But then, I saw someone appear. A man, slowly stepping out of the darkness. No, not a man. It was me, my past self, wearing the same shirt I had when I was a student. I looked younger, thinner, more haggard. The me on the screen stood in front of the metal door, placing his hand on it. The door slowly opened. Inside, there was nothing but darkness. But from within that darkness, a hand reached out. A pale hand, longer than normal, the fingers slender and motionless. The me on the screen stared at that hand for a long moment. Then he shook hands with it. The television screen suddenly went black. I screamed, backing away from the chair, breathing heavily. But I couldn't take my eyes off the television. Because I remembered, I made a promise of 5 years ago. I made a deal. And now, it had returned to make me keep my word. A cold wind swept through the apartment, even though the windows were closed. Behind me, the television turned on again. This time, only a single image appeared on the screen. The metal door was still open. But now, it was no longer empty. Something was coming out. And I knew, no matter where I ran, no matter how hard I tried to forget, it would find me.